I never told my stepfather I was a Special Forces lieutenant colonel. I always acted like the quiet, obedient daughter he could easily walk all over. Then one night, my mother sent me her emergency code with a location pin from her own house. 10 minutes later, he learned exactly who I really was. My name is Megan. I am 34 years old, and until recently, I was the designated punching bag of my own family. As a military officer, I faced hostile situations around the globe, but none were as suffocating as sitting at my mother-us dining table. Last Saturday, I attended an upscale family dinner that was supposed to be a simple catch-up. Between courses of filet mignon and expensive wine, my stepfather leaned back in his chair smirking at me. "You know, Megan, it is a good thing you have a cushy government desk job because you would never survive in the real corporate world." I simply sipped my water and smiled. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to hide your true strength from toxic people who underestimated your worth. Growing up in our affluent neighborhood meant projecting a flawless image to the outside world, but inside our sprawling modern estate, a deep emotional coldness permeated every single room. The dining room where we gathered that evening was a fortress of wealth and intimidation. Crystal chandeliers hung low over a massive mahogany table that felt more like a battlefield than a place for family to break bread. Bradley. My stepfather sat at the head of the table like a king surveying his conquered territory. He wore an expensive tailored suit and a gold watch that cost more than most people make in a year. His presence was designed to take up all the oxygen in the room. Flanking him were his two biological children, Trent and Ashlyn. They were the very definition of entitled trust fund kids. Trent was 30 years old, but still lived off his father's U.S. credit cards, constantly failing at new business ventures that Bradley always bailed him out of. Ashlyn was 28 and treated the world like her own personal runway, looking down her nose at anyone who did not wear designer labels. And then there was me. I sat quietly in my modest gray blouse and slacks, blending into the background exactly as they wanted me to. But my quietness was not born of weakness. It was a tactical choice. My sole focus that entire evening was on my mother, Susan. She sat opposite Bradley, and the sight of her made my chest tighten with a mixture of profound sadness and carefully concealed rage. My mother used to be a vibrant, successful woman who ran her own highly profitable logistics company. Now she looked terrified, exhausted, and visibly shrinking under Bradley U.S. control. Her shoulders were hunched, her eyes darted nervously around the room, and her hands trembled slightly whenever she reached for her water glass. She had lost weight, and the dark circles under her eyes spoke of countless sleepless nights. The dinner conversation was entirely monopolized by Bradley and his children. They loudly boasted about their upcoming luxury vacations, their expensive country club memberships, and the new sports cars Bradley had just purchased for them. I ate my salad in silence, perfectly content to be ignored. But peace was never an option when Bradley was in the room. He thrived on making others feel small, and I was his favorite target. "So Megan," Bradley said, his voice slicing through the clatter of silverware. He rested his elbows on the table and stared at me with a condescending smirk. "Are you still pushing government papers at that boring desk job of yours? I hear the military pays pennies compared to the private sector. Are you sure you do not want Trent to get you an entry-level job at his new consulting firm? You might actually make a living wage." Trent snickered and took a large gulp of his wine. "Come on, Dad," he said, wiping his mouth. "Megan does not have the killer instinct for consulting. She likes hiding in her little cubicle where no one expects anything from her. Besides, did you see the car she drove up in tonight? That old sedan is an eyesore in our driveway. I was embarrassed that the neighbors might think it belonged to us." Ashlyn chimed in immediately, her high-pitched laugh echoing off the dining room walls. "Seriously, Megan," she said, swirling her wine glass, "that car is a tragedy. And your outfit is not much better. You are 34 years old, but you dress like a tired librarian. I know you do not make much money, But you could at least try to look presentable when you come to a nice house like this. I could take you shopping if you need fashion charity. I took a slow, deep breath, letting their insults wash over me. In my world out in the field, arrogance like theirs got people killed. My true job involved high-stakes tactical operations, counter-terrorism strategies, and leading highly trained soldiers through life-or-death situations. The car they were mocking was a deliberate choice to remain inconspicuous. The clothes they hated were practical. I could have easily dismantled their entire egos with 3 words, but I chose absolute silence. I looked across the table at my mother. Susan was gripping her napkin so tightly her knuckles were white. She opened her mouth as if to defend me, but Bradley shot her a sharp, icy glare that instantly silenced her. "Do not interrupt Ashlyn when she is trying to be helpful, Susan," he snapped. "Your daughter needs to learn how the real world works. She has been coddled for too long." My mother immediately lowered her head and whispered a quiet apology, staring down at her plate. Seeing her submit to him so completely made my blood boil. Every instinct I had, honed in the military, screamed at me to stand up, grab Bradley by the collar of his expensive suit, and teach him a lesson in respect. I knew exactly how to neutralize a threat. I knew 12 different ways to break his arm before he could even register what was happening. But I forced my muscles to relax. I stayed silent because I knew the extreme imbalance of power in this house. Bradley had spent the last several years isolating my mother, cutting her off from her friends, and taking over the finances of her business. If I caused a scene tonight, he would not take it out on me. He would take it out on her after I left. He would make her life a living hell, and I could not risk collateral damage. So I swallowed my pride. I let Trent and Ashlyn laugh at my expense. I let Bradley feel like the smartest, most powerful man in the room. "Well, Bradley," I said, keeping my voice perfectly even and entirely devoid of emotion, "I appreciate your concern for my career. The government job pays the bills and it keeps me busy. I prefer a quiet life anyway." Bradley chuckled, a harsh grating sound that filled the dining room. "A quiet life," he mocked. "That is just a polite way of saying you lack ambition. Look at Trent and Ashlyn. They understand what it takes to dominate their fields. They have the drive. You are just coasting, Megan. You always have been. It is a shame, really, but I suppose every family has its underachiever." Ashlyn leaned forward, resting her chin on her hands. "Do not feel too bad, Megan," she purred with fake sympathy. "We cannot all be winners. Someone has to do the boring paperwork so the rest of us can actually run the world." I gave her a bland smile, refusing to give them the reaction they so desperately wanted. I focused entirely on my food, chewing methodically, while my mind analyzed the situation like a tactical map. Bradley was testing boundaries, pushing to see how much abuse I would take. He was performing for his children, showing them that he was the absolute authority figure. But more importantly, he was performing for my mother, showing her that no one, not even her own daughter, could stand up to him. The rest of the dinner dragged on like a slow, agonizing march. Bradley ordered the staff to clear the plates and bring out an expensive dessert wine. He raised his glass to make a toast entirely focused on his own magnificence. To my continued success, he announced proudly, "And to the future of the company. We are making big moves this year, and it is all thanks to my leadership." He did not mention that the company he was boasting about had been built from the ground up by my mother long before she ever met him. He had simply married into her wealth and slowly, systematically wrestled control away from her. I looked at Susan again. She raised her glass mechanically, her eyes dull and defeated. She was a hostage in her own home, trapped in a psychological prison built by a man who thrived on tearing women down. When the excruciating dinner finally came to an end, I stood up and politely thanked them for the meal. Bradley did not even look at me as I gathered my coat. Trent and Ashlyn were already busy looking at their phones, ignoring my departure entirely. My mother walked me to the front door, her steps slow and heavy. As we stood in the grand entryway away from Bradley, us prying eyes for just a brief moment, she reached out and grabbed my hand. Her fingers were ice cold. "I am sorry, Megan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I am so sorry he talks to you like that. You are a good daughter." I squeezed her hand tightly, trying to silently convey the strength she had lost. "It is okay, Mom," I whispered back, making sure my tone was steady and reassuring. Let him talk. It does not bother me. You just take care of yourself, okay? Call me if you ever need anything. Anything at all. She nodded, but the fear in her eyes did not fade. As I walked out to my unremarkable car, leaving the towering, oppressive mansion behind, I knew the situation was reaching a critical breaking point. Bradley was getting bolder, and my mother was fading faster. I drove away from the affluent suburb, my mind shifting from the quiet, obedient daughter back into the highly trained operative I truly was. I did not know it yet, but the silence I had maintained that evening was about to be shattered. The facade was coming to an end, and the real war was about to begin. The drive back to the city was a necessary decompression. I watched the sprawling gated communities fade into the rearview mirror, replaced by the brutalist concrete and steel of the downtown skyline. My apartment building was inconspicuous, anonymous, and highly secure. Exactly how I preferred it. I badged through the underground garage scanner, parked my unassuming sedan in its designated spot, and took the service elevator to the top floor. The moment the heavy steel door of my apartment clicked shut behind me, the suffocating persona of the quiet disappointment melted away. I walked straight to the bathroom and turned on the harsh overhead lights. I stared at my reflection and began dismantling the disguise. I pulled the tight, severe pins from my hair, letting it fall loose around my shoulders. I aggressively scrubbed away the minimal makeup I wore to make myself look tired and unremarkable. Then I peeled off the drab gray blouse and the shapeless slacks, tossing them carelessly onto a chair in the corner. Underneath that frumpy, carefully constructed disguise, my body was a map of combat deployments and rigorous physical conditioning. Deep scars traced the line of my collarbone and wrapped around my left bicep brutal souvenirs from classified operations in regions that did not officially exist on any government ledger. My apartment was a stark, jarring contrast to Bradley's mansion of excess. There were no crystal chandeliers, mahogany dining tables, or pretentious displays of unearned wealth here. The space was austere, minimalist, and meticulously organized down to the millimeter. On the far wall of my living room hung a locked, heavy glass shadow box containing my Silver Star 2 Purple Hearts and the unmistakable silver oak leaf insignia of a Special Forces lieutenant colonel. I had spent over a decade leading elite tactical teams through the most hostile, unpredictable environments on the planet. I was extensively trained to assess, neutralize, and dismantle high-level threats before they even knew they were being targeted. To Bradley, Trent, and Ashlyn, I was a glorified paper pusher who could not survive in the corporate world. To the Department of Defense, I was a designated highly lethal asset. I walked over to the biometric safe bolted flush against the reinforced concrete wall of my bedroom. I pressed my right thumb against the glowing scanner. A soft mechanical whir signaled the release of the heavy locking mechanism. The steel door swung open, revealing a pristine, meticulously maintained arsenal. I reached for my customized tactical sidearm, a sleek matte black pistol that felt like a natural extension of my own arm. I dropped the magazine, checked the chamber, and began the methodical, rhythmic process of field stripping the weapon. The sharp metallic scent of gun oil and cold steel filled the air, grounding my senses. This routine was my meditation. This was exactly how I scrubbed the toxic residue of my family from my mind after every forced interaction. As I wiped down the slide with a microfiber cloth, my thoughts drifted back to my mother. The hollow, defeated look in her eyes at the dinner table haunted my periphery. I knew Bradley had been systematically isolating her for years, but tonight the sheer silent terror radiating from her had felt dangerously acute. I reassembled the weapon with a sharp, satisfying click and slid it into a specialized concealed inside the waistband holster. The digital clock on my nightstand shifted to 11:42 p.m. The domestic quiet of my apartment was absolute, broken only by the low, steady hum of the city traffic far below my windows. Then the silence violently shattered. My secured tactical phone resting on the kitchen granite counter emitted a sharp, piercing chime. It was a high-priority alert tone I had programmed for only one specific contact in the world. I crossed the room in 3 rapid strides and snatched the device from the counter. The bright screen illuminated the dark kitchen. It was a text message from my mother. It did not say hello. It did not ask for help or explain a situation. It contained only two simple words: Blue Orchid. My blood ran completely cold. The muscles in my back coiled tight. Blue Orchid. It was a pre-established emergency code I had forced my mother to memorize 3 years ago when Bradley first started showing the darker shades of his true colors. I had looked her directly in the eyes and told her to use it only if her life was in immediate critical danger, and she could not speak safely on a phone call. It was the absolute equivalent of pulling a fire alarm in a burning building. A fraction of a second later, another message populated the illuminated screen. It was a dropped location pin showing her exact GPS coordinates. She was still inside Bradley's mansion, specifically in the West Wing, where he kept his heavily soundproofed private study. The proximity and the late-night timing painted a terrifying tactical picture. He had her cornered, and she was terrified for her life. The daughter who bit her tongue at the dinner table and tolerated arrogant insults vanished instantly. The Special Forces Lieutenant Colonel took complete command of my central nervous system. My elevated heart rate dropped, steadying into a calm, rhythmic, tactical cadence. My visual focus narrowed to a razor-sharp point. All residual emotional fear or anxiety was immediately replaced by cold, calculated operational efficiency. I had a hostage situation on my hands. The hostage was a high-value target I cared deeply about. The hostile combatant was arrogant, completely untrained in actual combat, and blissfully unaware of the lethality currently bearing down on him. I moved swiftly back to the biometric safe and began pulling out my tactical gear. I stripped off my civilian undergarments and pulled on a black moisture-wicking combat shirt and dark tactical pants, designed for maximum mobility and zero-friction noise. I grabbed my lightweight assault boots, lacing them up with rapid precision, pulling the heavy nylon laces tight and securing them flat against my ankles so nothing could catch or trip me. I strapped the concealed holster to my right hip, ensuring the draw was smooth and unobstructed. I secured a backup fixed-blade tactical knife in a discreet sheath at the small of my lower back. From the top shelf of the armory safe, I grabbed a pair of heavy-duty military-grade flex cuffs and tucked them deep into a zippered cargo pocket. Finally, I fitted a discreet encrypted communication earpiece into my left ear, syncing it automatically with my secured phone for hands-free communication and constant GPS tracking updates. A normal civilian in this scenario would dial 911 immediately. I did not even consider it for a fraction of a second. I knew the local police chief in that affluent, gated suburb perfectly well. Chief Miller was a regular fixture at Bradley's exclusive country club. They played 18 holes of golf every Sunday morning, and Bradley generously funded the local Police Benevolence Association with his stolen wealth. If I called emergency dispatch, standard operating procedure would require them to call Bradley's house first to verify the domestic disturbance, or they would send a patrol car with sirens blaring and lights flashing. Chief Miller would absolutely give Bradley a heads up as a professional courtesy to a wealthy donor. A preliminary warning would give Bradley all the time he needed to hide any physical evidence, force my mother into a fabricated cover story, or worse, panic, and escalate his physical violence against her before a squad car ever pulled into the circular driveway. Involving local law enforcement would either get my mother killed tonight or involuntarily committed to a psychiatric facility tomorrow morning, just as Bradley had been secretly threatening to do for months. This situation required a stealth breach and the immediate violent neutralization of the primary threat. It required someone who did not have to follow the local police chief's polite suburban protocols. I grabbed my car keys and walked out of the apartment, locking the heavy steel door behind me without looking back. I completely bypassed the slow-moving elevator and took the concrete emergency stairwell, moving down the flights with rapid, silent, disciplined steps. My mind was already downloading and mapping the architectural layout of the sprawling estate. I knew the precise blind spots in Bradley's ridiculously expensive perimeter security system because I had secretly analyzed them during holiday visits. I knew the exact response time of his neighborhood private security patrol, which was sluggish and lazy at best. I knew the specific layout of the West Wing study, including the heavy oak doors and the structural weak points of the locking mechanisms. I climbed into the driver's seat of my unassuming sedan. The engine purred to life instantly, and I peeled out of the underground parking garage, merging aggressively onto the nearly empty midnight highway. The drive that normally took 45 minutes in heavy daytime traffic would take me 20 minutes tonight. I pushed the accelerator down hard, weaving through the sparse late-night vehicles with aggressive precision. The city lights blurred past my windows, turning into long, bright streaks of neon and amber. I was entirely detached from the emotional weight of the domestic tragedy. There was no blind anger left in me, only a chilling, absolute focus on the mission objective. Bradley thought he had married a weak, vulnerable woman and gained a pathetic, cowardly stepdaughter he could use as a verbal punching bag. He genuinely thought his stolen money, his designer suits, and his massive arrogance made him untouchable in his ivory tower. He was about to learn a very painful, permanent lesson about the vast difference between corporate boardroom bullying and actual kinetic warfare. I tapped my fingers against the steering wheel, keeping time with my steady, controlled breathing. "Hold on, Mom," I said to the dark, empty car. "The cavalry is coming." The transition from the highway to the affluent suburb was stark and immediate. The aggressive concrete of the city gave way to smooth, winding asphalt roads, lined with ancient oak trees and manicured hedges. The streetlights here were deliberately dimmed to preserve the exclusive, secluded atmosphere of the neighborhood. I killed my headlights a quarter-mile from the estate, letting the car roll silently into a shadowed cul-de-sac that bordered a dense wooded area. I put the vehicle in park and killed the engine. The silence of the wealthy suburb was heavy, but my mind was entirely consumed by the mission parameters. I stepped out of the vehicle and closed the door with a controlled push, avoiding the loud mechanical click of a slammed door. The cool night air hit my face, but I barely registered the temperature. Every sense I had was heightened, tuned entirely to the environment around me. I moved rapidly through the wooded buffer zone, keeping my profile low and my footsteps placed carefully to avoid snapping loose branches. The heavy combat boots I wore were designed for stealth, absorbing the impact of my weight as I navigated the uneven terrain. Through the thick canopy of trees, the massive stone perimeter wall of Bradley U.S. Estate loomed ahead. It was 12 feet high, topped with decorative wrought iron spikes that were meant to look elegant but were entirely designed to keep unwanted elements out. To a civilian, the wall was an impenetrable fortress. To me, it was a minor obstacle. I had scouted this exact perimeter during a mandated Thanksgiving visit 2 years ago, mapping out the structural vulnerabilities while pretending to admire the landscaping. I reached the base of the wall and pressed my back against the cold stone, regulating my breathing. I looked up and located the primary security camera mounted on the corner pillar. It was a high-end pan and tilt model equipped with thermal imaging and night vision. Bradley loved bragging about the cost of his security system at dinner parties, believing throwing money at a contractor guaranteed absolute safety. But contractors build predictable patterns. The camera swept the perimeter in a standard 45-degree arc, taking exactly 14 seconds to complete a full rotation. I tracked its movement, counting the seconds in my head. When the lens panned away toward the main gate, I moved. I launched myself upward, finding a small, familiar fissure in the mortar. I pulled myself up with a surge of upper body strength, gripping the base of an iron spike and swinging my legs over the top of the wall in one fluid, silent motion. I dropped down into the soft, manicured grass on the other side, landing in a crouch just as the camera completed its rotation back to my sector. I was entirely cloaked in the deep shadow cast by a massive, decorative weeping willow. I held my position for a full minute, listening to the ambient sounds of the estate. There were no guard dogs. Bradley hated animals because they were messy. The private neighborhood security patrol had just passed 5 minutes before my arrival, meaning I had a solid 20-minute window before their next scheduled rotation. The operational timeline was tight but completely manageable. I moved across the sprawling lawn, sticking to the deepest shadows and avoiding the motion-activated floodlights positioned near the primary pathways. I bypassed the grand front entrance entirely. That was where the security sensors were thickest, heavily monitored by glass break detectors and reinforced smart locks. Instead, I navigated toward the side of the house where the catering kitchen and staff entrances were located. Bradley had recently fired the longtime domestic staff to further isolate my mother, meaning this sector of the house was entirely empty at this hour. I reached the heavy service door and knelt beside the lock. It was a high-grade commercial deadbolt tied directly into the central alarm system. A brute force entry would instantly trigger a silent alarm to the security company. I reached into my cargo pocket and retrieved a specialized electronic bypass tool I had acquired during my counterintelligence training. I connected the small device to the digital keypad housing, running a localized scrambling sequence that temporarily froze the circuit reporting status. The system still believed the door was perfectly secured. With the digital alarm neutralized, I pulled a pair of tension wrenches and a rake pick from my belt. I slid the tools into the mechanical keyway, applying precise pressure to the internal pins. In less than 20 seconds, the cylinder gave way with a soft click. I turned the handle slowly, easing the heavy door open just enough to slip my body through the gap. I stepped into the dark catering kitchen and closed the door silently behind me. The interior of the house was suffocatingly quiet. The air conditioning hummed faintly, pushing cold, processed air through the massive ventilation ducts. The smell of expensive leather and chemical floor cleaner filled the space. I paused in the darkness, allowing my eyes to fully adjust to the ambient light filtering through the large windows. My tactical earpiece remained silent, indicating no incoming calls or alerts. I was a ghost inside the machine. I drew my customized tactical sidearm from its holster, keeping the muzzle pointed safely down at a low, ready position. I did not intend to use lethal force, but protocol dictated that an unknown hostile environment required complete readiness for any sudden escalation. I moved out of the kitchen and into the main corridor, stepping carefully off the polished hardwood floors and onto the thick Persian runners to completely muffle the sound of my boots. I cleared the formal dining room and the grand living area, using standard military slicing the pie techniques around every corner. The rooms were empty, perfectly staged, and devoid of any actual life. As I approached the grand staircase leading to the second floor, I stopped abruptly. My enhanced hearing picked up a faint, muffled sound echoing down the long hallway that led to the west wing. It was not a voice, but the sharp scrape of heavy furniture moving against a wood floor, followed by a sharp intake of breath. The sound was coming directly from Bradley's private study, the same location indicated by the emergency GPS pin my mother had sent. The tactical assessment solidified in my mind. The target was isolated, the location was confirmed, and the threat level to the hostage was actively escalating. I altered my route, abandoning the stairs and moving with accelerated stealth down the West Wing corridor. The hallway was lined with ostentatious oil paintings and antique vases sitting on fragile pedestals. I navigated the cluttered space with lethal grace, my eyes locked on the heavy double oak doors at the far end of the hall. A sliver of warm yellow light spilled out from underneath the doors, slicing across the dark hallway floor. As I closed the distance, the muffled sounds became distinct voices. "You are going to sign every single page, Susan Bradley." His voice was a low, venomous growl, entirely stripped of the charming corporate facade he wore in public. It was the voice of a predator who believed he had finally trapped his prey. "Please, Bradley, you are hurting me. My mother." Us voice trembled, fragile, and laced with pure physical pain. "I cannot read what these are. Let me go." "You do not need to read them, you stupid woman," he hissed. The sharp sound of paper being slammed onto a hard wooden surface echoed through the thick doors. "You just need to hold the pen. You have been losing your mind for months. Everyone knows it. If you do not sign these trust transfers tonight, I will have the medics here by morning to haul you off to the psychiatric ward. Do you think anyone will believe a crazy woman over me?" I reached the double doors. They were slightly ajar, left open just an inch in Bradley's arrogant haste. I positioned my body against the wall and peered through the narrow gap, assessing the room before making entry. The study was a monument to Bradley's ego, lined with dark mahogany bookshelves and centered around a massive antique desk. The desk lamp cast a harsh, localized pool of light over the center of the room. My mother was pinned against the edge of the heavy desk. Her face was pale and streaked with tears. Bradley stood directly behind her, his large frame pressing her forward. His left hand was clamped down hard on the back of her neck, holding her in place. His right hand had a brutal, twisting grip on her right wrist, forcing her hand down toward a thick stack of legal documents spread across the leather desk pad. I could clearly see the titles of the documents illuminated by the lamp. They were irrevocable trust transfers and comprehensive power of attorney declarations. He was literally breaking her wrist to force her to sign away her entire inherited fortune and her legal autonomy in one sweeping, violent act. I did not wait for another command. I holstered my sidearm, realizing that firing a weapon would complicate the legal aftermath and that Bradley did not warrant the use of a bullet. I reached back and smoothly drew the fixed-blade tactical knife from the sheath at my lower back, keeping it concealed behind my forearm. I stepped directly in front of the double doors, placed my hands flat against the heavy oak wood, and shoved them open. The doors swung wide, hitting the interior walls with a resounding crack that shattered the tension in the room. I stepped into the study, stepping directly into the pool of light. I did not yell. I did not issue a warning or a dramatic demand for him to let her go. I simply stood there, my posture locked into a rigid combat stance, my eyes boring directly into his. Bradley jumped slightly at the sudden noise, his head snapping up to look at the doorway. When he saw me standing there, dressed in full tactical gear, bathed in the shadows of the doorway, his expression did not register immediate fear. His deep-seated arrogance overrode his survival instincts. He blinked in momentary confusion, failing to reconcile the quiet, frumpy stepdaughter from the dinner table with the operator currently standing in his private sanctuary. He did not release his punishing grip on my mother-us wrist. Instead, his initial shock morphed rapidly into deep annoyance. He let out a harsh, dismissive laugh, shaking his head as if I were a child playing dress-up in his house. "What the hell are you wearing, Megan?" he sneered, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. "Did you actually break into my house in a Halloween costume? What is the little girl going to do about this? Are you going to call the police and tell them your mother is having a mental episode? Because Chief Miller is already on speed dial. Now get out of my house before I have you arrested for trespassing." He smirked, confident that his wealth, his status, and his sheer physical size made him the undisputed master of the situation. He tightened his grip on my mother's arm, causing her to let out a sharp cry of pain. He looked at me, waiting for me to run away, crying exactly as he expected the weak, obedient daughter to do. He had absolutely no idea that his timeline for survival had just expired. I did not break eye contact as I crossed the 20 feet of mahogany flooring between the doorway and the heavy desk. I moved with a fluid, explosive speed that gave Bradley absolutely no time to process my approach or adjust his defensive posture. He opened his mouth to deliver another condescending threat, but the words never materialized. In precisely 3 seconds, the entire power dynamic of the household shifted permanently. I slipped the tactical knife back into its sheath, dropping my center of gravity to slip under his peripheral vision. My left hand shot forward, driving the heel of my palm hard into the radial nerve bundle on the inside of his right forearm. The strike was calibrated to cause an immediate involuntary muscle spasm. Bradley gasped as his brutal grip on my mother broke instantly, his fingers springing open as a sudden shockwave of numbness ran all the way up to his shoulder. Before he could recoil or throw a blind punch, I pivoted my hips and secured his newly freed wrist with both of my hands. I stepped deep into his personal space, twisting his arm outward and leveraging my shoulder against his thick tricep. I applied a highly specialized close-quarters compliance hold, known in military combatives as a reverse wrist lock with a shoulder pin. It is a specific technique designed to inflict maximum debilitating pain by manipulating the tendons and joint capsules without leaving a single bruise or physical mark on the skin. I drove his wrist toward the high ceiling while simultaneously forcing his massive body weight downward. Bradley let out a choked, agonizing scream as the pressure on his rotator cuff peaked. His knees buckled immediately, hitting the expensive hardwood floor with a heavy reverberating thud. I maintained the lock standing over him while he writhed and gasped for air. His arrogant smirk was entirely gone, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated shock and agony. He tried to thrash wildly to free himself, but any sudden movement only tightened the severe torque on his shoulder socket, threatening to tear the joint completely out of its socket. "Do not move a single muscle, Bradley," I commanded, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "If you twitch, I will snap this joint like dry kindling. Do you understand me?" He let out a pathetic whimper of pain, nodding his head frantically as a heavy bead of sweat rolled down his red face. I kept the physical pressure locked firmly in place with one hand and used my free hand to gently pull my mother away from the edge of the desk. Susan was shaking violently, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. She could not comprehend how her quiet, unassuming daughter was currently holding her massive, abusive husband pinned to the floor with effortless precision. "Get behind me, Mom," I instructed, keeping my eyes locked on Bradley. "You are safe now. He is not going to touch you ever again." Susan scurried behind my back, clutching her bruised wrist against her chest. I reached down and snatched the thick stack of irrevocable trust transfers and power of attorney documents from the leather desk pad, folding them quickly and shoving them deep into my zippered cargo pocket. Those papers were the physical evidence of his extortion, and I was absolutely not leaving them for him to destroy. "What the hell is going on in here?" a loud voice bellowed from the hallway. Trent and Ashlyn burst through the double doors, their faces flushed from the wine they had been drinking downstairs. They stopped dead in their tracks, their eyes widening in absolute horror at the scene unfolding in their father's private sanctuary. Trent looked from my tactical boots up to the military combat shirt and finally to my face. He could not process the visual information. The woman holding his giant, untouchable father on the floor in a weeping heap was the exact same woman he had mocked for driving an old sedan just 2 hours ago. "Let him go!" Trent yelled, his false bravado kicking in as he took a clumsy, aggressive step forward, clenching his fists. "I am warning you. Megan, let him go right now, or I will lay you out." I did not even blink. I increased the torque on Bradley's wrist by a fraction of a millimeter, causing him to let out a sharp, shrill scream that echoed off the tall bookshelves. "Take one more step, Trent," I said, my voice slicing through the room like a scalpel. "Take one more step toward me, and I will dislocate your father's shoulder. Then I will put you on the floor right next to him. I promise you it will take me less than 4 seconds." Trent froze, his bravado evaporating instantly. He looked at his father, writhing in pain, and realized I was not bluffing in the slightest. He backed away, his hands raised defensively. Ashlyn let out a hysterical shriek, pulling her expensive smartphone from her designer purse with trembling fingers. "I am calling the police!" Ashlyn screamed, her voice cracking with panic. "You are a complete psychopath, Megan. You are going to jail for assault. I am calling Chief Miller right now." "Make the call, Ashlyn," I replied calmly, maintaining the joint lock on Bradley. "Tell them to send a patrol car." Ashlyn dialed the numbers, frantically crying into the receiver as she claimed a violent intruder was attacking her father. I knew exactly what was about to happen, and I was fully prepared for it. I held Bradley pinned to the floor for another 7 long minutes, listening to his ragged breathing and the distant sound of approaching sirens cutting through the quiet suburban night. The flashing red and blue lights soon illuminated the large windows of the study, casting eerie moving shadows across the walls. Heavy footsteps pounded up the grand staircase and rushed down the hallway. 2 local police officers burst into the study with their hands resting defensively on their duty belts. They were young, aggressive, and clearly familiar with the layout of the house. Ashlyn ran toward them, pointing a manicured finger at me while sobbing dramatically. "Officers!" Bradley gasped, his voice taking on a desperate, victimized tone the very moment law enforcement entered the room. "Thank God you are here. She is crazy. She attacked me unprovoked." I released the joint lock, stepping back smoothly and raising my hands to shoulder height to show I was unarmed and completely compliant. Bradley scrambled backward, clutching his shoulder and putting distance between us. He leaned heavily against the desk, painting a perfect picture of an innocent man victimized in his own home. She is a disgruntled veteran, officers. Bradley lied smoothly, his corporate charm returning as he saw his local allies. She is my stepdaughter. She has been having severe mental health issues. She broke into my home wearing tactical gear and physically assaulted me. Look at my wife, she is terrified. She is trying to extort money from us. Arrest her immediately. The officers did not bother to ask for my side of the story. They saw a wealthy, powerful donor claiming assault, and they saw a woman in combat gear standing over him. The taller officer stepped forward, pulling a pair of heavy metal handcuffs from his belt. His expression was stern and unforgiving. "Turn around and face the wall, miss," the officer commanded, taking another step toward me. "Put your hands behind your back. You are under arrest for breaking and entering and aggravated assault." I did not move toward the wall. I maintained my calm professional posture, locking eyes with the officer. "Officer, before you make a severe career-ending mistake, I highly recommend you look at the identification inside the left breast pocket of my uniform," I said clearly. "Do not listen to her," Bradley shouted from the desk, pointing a shaking finger at me. "She is highly dangerous. Cuff her now." The officer hesitated, but my authoritative tone gave him pause. He reached forward cautiously and extracted the heavy laminated credential wallet from my pocket. He flipped it open, and his eyes widened dramatically as he read the silver embossed lettering and the high security clearance codes. It was my official Department of Defense identification, designating my rank as a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army Special Forces with active federal clearance. While he was staring at the credentials, I reached into my right cargo pocket and pulled out my secured tactical phone. I hit a single speed dial button and put the device on speakerphone, setting the volume to maximum. The line rang twice before a deep, commanding voice answered. Magistrate Davis speaking, the voice boomed, filling the quiet study. "Your Honor, this is Lieutenant Colonel Megan Hayes," I stated, projecting my voice so every single person in the room could hear clearly. "I am currently securing a hostile scene at the residence of Bradley Vance. I have successfully interrupted an active extortion and physical hostage situation involving a high-ranking military officer dependent. The dependent is my mother, Susan Hayes. The hostile target was utilizing physical force to compel the signing of fraudulent financial documents." There was a brief silence on the line before the federal magistrate responded, his tone shifting to absolute legal authority. "Understood, Lieutenant Colonel. What is your current status?" "The situation is physically contained." "Your Honor," I replied, looking directly at the pale, sweating faces of the two local police officers. "However, I currently have two local municipal officers attempting to place me under arrest based on the false testimony of the extortionist. I am officially invoking federal jurisdiction over this scene under the Service Members Civil Relief Act and federal statutes regarding the extortion and physical endangerment of a military dependent." "Put the ranking local officer on the line," Magistrate Davis commanded. I held the phone out toward the taller officer. He swallowed hard, his hand trembling slightly as he leaned toward the speaker. "This is Officer Jenkins, Your Honor." Officer Jenkins, Magistrate Davis, said, his voice cold and uncompromising. "You are standing in the middle of an active federal crime scene. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes has full federal authority to secure her dependent mother and preserve all financial evidence in that room. You are to stand down immediately. If you place a single hand on that officer or attempt to interfere with her extraction of the victim, I will personally see to it that you are charged with obstruction of a federal investigation. You will secure the perimeter and wait for the federal agents who are currently en route to your location. Do you understand me?" "Yes, Your Honor." Officer Jenkins stammered, stepping back so quickly he nearly bumped into his partner. "We understand completely. We are standing down." I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. I reached out and calmly took my Department of Defense credentials back from the stunned officer, tucking them safely away. The entire room had been effectively paralyzed by the overwhelming shift in legal power. Trent and Ashlyn were backed against the far wall, their mouths hanging open in silent disbelief. Their impenetrable bubble of wealth and local influence had just been violently popped. They looked at their father, expecting him to yell or bribe his way out of the situation, but Bradley was completely speechless. Bradley slumped against the heavy mahogany desk, his face drained of all color. The arrogant corporate king who had spent years making my mother and me feel like worthless burdens was finally realizing the catastrophic magnitude of his miscalculation. He had brought a local golf buddy police chief to a federal war, and he had just lost everything. He stared at me, his chest heaving, as the reality of my true identity sank in. I was not the quiet, obedient stepdaughter he could casually destroy. I was his absolute worst nightmare. The extraction from the sprawling estate was executed with clinical precision. I did not wait for the federal agents to arrive at the property. My primary objective was the immediate physical and psychological safety of the hostage. I guided my mother out the front door, walking right past the stunned local officers and the trembling forms of Trent and Ashlyn. Bradley remained slumped against his mahogany desk, clutching his shoulder, his eyes burning with a venomous, silent promise of retaliation. He was temporarily defeated, but a man with his level of malignant narcissism and financial resources was never truly neutralized after a single physical confrontation. He was a cornered predator, and predators are exceptionally dangerous when they have time to regroup. I secured my mother in the passenger seat of my sedan and drove us straight to a secure temporary safe house located on the outskirts of the city. The safe house was a property maintained by a trusted network of former military contractors, completely off the grid and entirely untraceable by Bradley U.S. private investigators. Once inside the fortified walls, the adrenaline that had been sustaining my mother finally crashed. She collapsed onto the small sofa, weeping quietly into her hands. I sat beside her, running a soothing hand over her back while applying a medical-grade cold compress to her severely bruised wrist. For the first time in her life, she was seeing me not as the quiet disappointment, but as a highly capable protector. I made her hot tea and promised her that the nightmare was ending, but I knew the tactical reality. The initial skirmish was a decisive victory, but the actual war was just beginning. The counterstrike hit us at exactly 8 in the morning. I was standing in the safe house kitchen monitoring local police scanners and federal dispatch frequencies when my mother let out a sharp gasp from the living room. She was staring at the screen of her smartphone, her hands shaking violently. Every single one of her personal bank accounts had been locked. Her credit cards were suddenly declining. Her access to her own company portal had been digitally revoked overnight. I moved to her side and took the phone, analyzing the banking notifications. The accounts were not just locked for suspicious activity, they were legally frozen by a court-mandated emergency injunction. Bradley had not wasted a single second of the night. While we were securing a safe location, he was mobilizing an army of high-priced, ruthless corporate attorneys. He had woken up a sympathetic county judge in the middle of the night, presenting a masterfully fabricated narrative of domestic terrorism and elder abuse. My own secured phone buzzed with an incoming encrypted file from a contact at the federal courthouse. I opened the digital document and read through Bradley U.S. emergency filing. It was a masterpiece of legal gaslighting and character assassination. He had weaponized every single piece of information he had against us. The legal brief painted a horrifying, completely fictional picture. According to Bradley and his legal team, I was not a heroic daughter intervening in an extortion attempt. Instead, I was an unstable, violent military veteran suffering from severe, untreated post-traumatic stress disorder. The document claimed I had snapped under the pressure of civilian life, broken into his peaceful suburban home in full tactical gear, and violently assaulted him without provocation. But the most insidious part of the filing was his characterization of my mother. Bradley presented fabricated medical affidavits from private concierge doctors he had heavily bribed. These fraudulent documents claimed that Susan was suffering from rapid onset dementia and severe cognitive decline. He argued that I had kidnapped my mentally incompetent mother to manipulate her out of her fortune, and that freezing her assets was the only way a loving husband could protect his sick wife from an opportunistic, unstable child. The local judge, who was likely another member of Bradley U.S. elite country club inner circle, had signed the emergency ex parte order without requiring our presence or testimony. The injunction stripped my mother of her financial autonomy completely. She was legally barred from accessing any funds, transferring any assets, or making any business decisions regarding the logistics company she had built from scratch. Bradley was granted temporary emergency conservatorship over her entire estate. He had effectively cut off our supply lines, leaving us stranded in the dark with no access to capital. My mother read over my shoulder, her breathing becoming shallow and erratic as she processed the sheer magnitude of the legal betrayal. "He took it all, Megan," she whispered, her voice cracking with despair. "He took the company. He took my savings. He is telling the world I am losing my mind. No one is going to believe us. He has the best lawyers in the state. He has the judges in his pocket. We have absolutely nothing." I set the phone face down on the table and looked my mother directly in the eyes. I needed to snap her out of the civilian panic spiral before it paralyzed her completely. I gripped her uninjured hand tightly, transferring my calm, absolute certainty into her. "Look at me, Mom," I commanded, my voice firm and unwavering. "You are not losing your mind. You are the victim of a highly coordinated psychological operation designed to make you doubt your own sanity. He is using your money to fund a legal war of attrition because he knows he cannot beat us in a fair fight." "But we have no money to fight back," she protested, tears welling in her eyes. "I cannot even pay for a lawyer. My cards are useless. We are backed into a corner." "That is exactly what he wants you to think," I replied, my mind already shifting into the next phase of operational planning. "He thinks cutting off the money cuts off our ability to maneuver. He thinks because he has a team of corporate lawyers, he holds the high ground. But Bradley only understands boardroom warfare. He only understands leveraging wealth and filing injunctions. He does not understand asymmetrical warfare. He does not understand what happens when a highly trained asset decides to dismantle a target from the inside out." I paced the length of the small living room, evaluating our tactical disadvantages. Bradley had the local legal system, the financial resources, and the public narrative currently leaning in his favor. Trent and Ashlyn would undoubtedly back up his fabricated story, providing false witness testimony about my supposed violent outburst and my mother's cognitive decline. They had effectively built a fortress of lies around the truth. However, a fortress built on lies requires massive amounts of structural maintenance to keep from collapsing. Bradley had to pay off doctors to fake medical records. He had to funnel money to keep his corrupt network intact. He had to actively manage the fraud. That meant there was a paper trail. There is always a paper trail. I realized that fighting him in a local courtroom right now would be a catastrophic waste of time and energy. We would be playing his game by his rules on his home turf. To win this, we had to circumvent his entire power structure. We needed to hit him where his high-priced lawyers could not protect him. I stopped pacing and turned back to my mother. Her tear-stained face was turned toward me, desperate for a solution. I needed to know exactly how deep Bradley's financial corruption went, and there was only one person who knew the structural foundation of my mother's company as well as she did. "Mom," I said, keeping my tone strictly professional. "Before Bradley started firing your loyal staff and replacing them with his cronies, who was the one person who handled your private estate and the deepest financials of the logistics company? Who was the one person Bradley perceived as an immediate threat and forced out first?" Susan blinked, wiping her eyes as she searched her memory. "It was Arthur," she said, her voice gaining a fraction of its former strength. "Arthur Hayes. He was my chief legal counsel and estate manager for 15 years. Bradley hated him. Bradley manufactured a scandal about Arthur mishandling funds and forced me to terminate his contract 3 years ago. I felt terrible about it, but Bradley convinced me Arthur was stealing." My tactical assessment crystallized instantly. Bradley eliminated Arthur Hayes because Arthur was competent enough to spot the hostile takeover before it gained momentum. Arthur Hayes was not a thief. He was a loose end that Bradley failed to tie up properly. "Do you know where Arthur is now?" I asked, my mind racing ahead to the next logistical step. Susan nodded slowly. "He opened a small private practice on the other side of the city. He refused to speak to me after the termination. He was deeply hurt." I grabbed my encrypted phone and pulled up a secure communication channel. "I am going to make contact with him," I stated. Bradley thinks freezing your bank accounts neutralizes our threat. He thinks we are currently cowering in a motel room terrified of his lawyers. We are going to let him believe exactly that. We will maintain absolute radio silence, giving him a false sense of security, while we gather the ammunition required to blow his entire life apart. I looked at the digital clock on the wall. The morning sun was rising, casting long shadows across the safe house floor. The initial adrenaline of the extraction had completely faded, leaving behind a cold, calculated determination. Bradley wanted to play dirty legal games and weaponize the justice system against the woman who gave him everything. He had successfully backed us into a corner, but he failed to realize the most fundamental rule of combat. You never back a lethal apex predator into a corner unless you are fully prepared to die in the ensuing bloodbath. I was not just going to clear my mother-us name or get her money back. I was going to surgically dismantle Bradley-us' entire existence until there was absolutely nothing left. The transition from the safe house to the covert meeting required the kind of operational security I hadn't used on domestic soil in years. I left my mother with Jax, the intelligence analyst, who had arrived at the safe house within an hour of my call. Jax was a ghost, a master of digital camouflage who could scrub our digital footprints while simultaneously monitoring Bradley's frantic legal maneuvering. Leaving my mother in his care was the only way I could step away and execute the next phase of the operation. I swapped the nondescript sedan for a rental car acquired under a corporate alias. I took a convoluted route through the city, employing counter-surveillance driving techniques to ensure I wasn't being tracked by Bradley's private investigators. The location was a small, unassuming diner on the outskirts of the industrial district, miles away from the polished glass towers where Bradley's lawyers operated. It was exactly the kind of place a man like Arthur Hayes would choose for a clandestine meeting. I arrived 15 minutes early, securing a corner booth with a clear view of the entrance and the street outside. Arthur walked in exactly on time. He didn't look like a high-powered estate lawyer who had once managed a multi-million-dollar logistics empire. He looked exhausted, his suit slightly rumpled, carrying a battered leather briefcase. But his eyes were sharp, scanning the diner with a wariness that suggested he had spent the last 3 years looking over his shoulder. I stood as he approached the booth. "Mr. Hayes, thank you for agreeing to meet." Arthur slid into the booth, placing the briefcase carefully on the table. He didn't offer a handshake. I hesitated. He admitted, his voice low and gravelly. "When you called, I wasn't sure if this was another one of Bradley's traps. But your mother... How is Susan?" "She's safe," I replied, keeping my tone measured. "I extracted her from the house last night, but Bradley hit us with an emergency injunction this morning. He froze her assets and claimed she's mentally unfit. He's citing early onset dementia." Arthur let out a harsh, bitter breath, shaking his head. "Dementia, that son of a bitch. I warned her. I warned her the day she married him, and I warned her the day he fired me. I told her he was laying the groundwork to steal everything." "I need to know exactly how he did it, Arthur," I said, leaning forward. "My mother is terrified. She genuinely believes she might be losing her mind because he spent years convincing her of it. I need the structural breakdown of his operation. I need the paper trail he tried to bury when he forced you out." Arthur looked at me, assessing my resolve. He reached for the battered briefcase and popped the latches. "You were always the quiet one, Megan. The one who stayed away from the family drama. But you don't look quiet today." "The quiet daughter doesn't exist anymore," I stated coldly. "I'm a Special Forces Lieutenant Colonel, and my mother is a hostage. Tell me how he broke her." Arthur pulled a thick, disorganized file from the briefcase. "It didn't happen overnight. Bradley is a parasite, but he's a patient one. He started small, right after the wedding. 6 years ago, Susan's logistics company was a fortress. She had a loyal executive team, a dedicated personal staff at the house, and a financial structure I had personally fortified against hostile takeovers." He laid out a series of organizational charts pointing to specific names. Bradley started with the domestic staff. He convinced Susan that the housekeeper of 15 years was stealing. He manufactured the evidence, planted jewelry, falsified receipts. Susan was devastated, but she fired the woman. Bradley immediately replaced her with someone from an agency he controlled. Someone who reported directly to him. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. The isolation tactics were textbook psychological warfare. He severed her immediate support network first. Exactly, Arthur confirmed. Once he controlled the house, he moved on to her friends. He started intercepting her mail, deleting voicemails, and declining invitations on her behalf, claiming she was too tired or feeling unwell. He created a narrative of isolation. Her friends thought she was withdrawing, and Susan thought her friends were abandoning her. Arthur pulled out a stack of medical records. Then came the gaslighting. This was the most insidious part. Bradley started hiding things, her keys, important documents, her medication. He would move items and then feign concern when she couldn't find them. He started suggesting she was becoming forgetful. He scheduled appointments with neurologists, doctors. He carefully selected and compensated well, who prescribed medications that made her lethargic and confused. The anger I had been carefully suppressing flared hot and bright. Bradley hadn't just stolen her money, he had deliberately poisoned her reality. He had subjected her to a slow, calculated psychological torture designed to break her spirit and make her entirely dependent on him. When did he make his move on the company? I asked, forcing my focus back to the tactical objective. 3 years ago, Arthur said, his voice tightening with residual anger. He targeted me. I was reviewing the quarterly logistics reports and noticed severe discrepancies. Funds were being diverted into shell corporations under the guise of consulting fees and expansion research. I confronted Bradley, and within 48 hours, he presented Susan with fabricated evidence that I was embezzling. He used the same tactic he used on the housekeeper, I observed. Yes, but Susan fought him on it initially. She trusted me. That's when Bradley escalated the dementia narrative. He convinced her that her paranoia regarding my termination was a symptom of her cognitive decline. He told her she was becoming a liability to the company, and that as her husband he needed to step in to protect her legacy. Arthur handed me a copy of a legal document. He forced her to sign a temporary power of attorney. Once I was out, he cleaned house. He fired the entire executive board and replaced them with his own people. Men like Trent and Ashlyn, who have absolutely no business running a logistics empire. They are bleeding the company dry, using it as a personal ATM. I reviewed the document. The signature was my mother's, but it was shaky and uneven, a stark contrast to her usually precise handwriting. It was the signature of a woman who was medicated, terrified, and fundamentally broken. He filed an injunction this morning claiming she needs a permanent conservatorship, I told Arthur. He's trying to lock her away legally so he can liquidate the remaining assets without interference. If he gets that conservatorship, Susan is finished, Arthur warned grimly. He will institutionalize her. He will stick her in a high-end facility, drug her into compliance, and drain the accounts until there is nothing left. And Trent and Ashlyn will help him do it. I leaned back in the booth, absorbing the massive scope of Bradley's betrayal. This wasn't just a greedy stepfather securing a comfortable retirement. This was a highly organized criminal conspiracy executed by a family of sociopaths. They had weaponized the legal system and the medical establishment to destroy a woman for profit. I need everything you have, Arthur, I said, my voice dangerously calm. Every discrepancy you found 3 years ago, every shell corporation name. I need the blueprints to his financial infrastructure. Arthur hesitated, his hand resting on the thick file. Megan Bradley is incredibly dangerous. He has judges in his pocket and a small army of corporate sharks ready to destroy anyone who challenges him. If you go after him with this, you are declaring open war. He will not hesitate to ruin your military career. My career is not the target, I replied, standing up and sliding the file across the table toward me. Bradley is. He thought he was playing a long game against a weak, vulnerable woman. He didn't realize he was setting the stage for his own absolute destruction. I'm not going to fight him in his corrupt courtrooms. I'm going to dismantle his entire existence. Arthur looked at me, the weariness in his eyes replaced by a flicker of genuine hope. He didn't see the quiet daughter anymore. He saw the operator who was about to execute a flawless, devastating counteroffensive. Take the file, Arthur said softly. Burn him to the ground, Megan. I tucked the file securely under my arm and walked out of the diner. The defensive phase of the operation was officially over. It was time to go on the offensive. Bradley Vance had spent 6 years building a fortress of lies. I was going to use his own arrogance to tear it down. The morning air was crisp and biting as I stepped out of the heavy glass doors of my apartment building. I had slept for exactly 4 hours, my internal clock waking me before dawn to review Arthur's files. The financial schematics were worse than I had anticipated. Bradley had constructed a labyrinth of shell companies, each layer designed to obscure the origin and destination of my mother's wealth. The scale of the embezzlement was staggering, demanding immediate, aggressive countermeasures. I zipped my dark jacket, the cold air a sharp reminder of the battle ahead. I needed coffee strong and black before finalizing the next operational phase with Jax. As I turned toward the local cafe down the block, a sleek, unnecessarily loud sports car abruptly pulled up to the curb, its tires screeching against the pavement. The engine revved aggressively before cutting off. The driver's side door swung open and Trent stepped out, adjusting the collar of an overpriced designer coat. Ashlyn emerged from the passenger side, her expression twisted into a familiar condescending sneer. They looked entirely out of place in this utilitarian working-class neighborhood, their polished entitlement clashing violently with the gray concrete surroundings. I stopped walking. I didn't reach for my weapon, but my situational awareness spiked. I scanned the street, noting the lack of immediate witnesses and the clear lines of sight. I deliberately relaxed my posture, adopting the stance of someone caught off guard, someone vulnerable. I let them believe they held the tactical advantage. Well, if it isn't the disgraced war hero, Trent sneered, slamming the car door shut. He leaned against the expensive vehicle, crossing his arms over his chest. I have to admit, Megan breaking into our house was a bold move. Stupid but bold. Did you really think you could just walk in, play dress-up, and take what doesn't belong to you? I took my mother, I said, keeping my voice low and completely devoid of emotion. And I stopped a physical assault. Ashlyn laughed, a sharp, grating sound that echoed off the brick buildings. Physical assault, please. You assaulted our father. You're lucky he hasn't had you thrown in federal prison yet. But don't worry, his lawyers are working on it. They're going to tear your little military career to shreds. I kept my hands visible, resting loosely at my sides. My right hand brushed against the pocket of my jacket where my secured tactical phone sat. With a subtle, practiced movement, I engaged the audio recording function. The device was engineered to capture high-fidelity sound, even through layers of fabric, ensuring every word spoken in my immediate vicinity was perfectly preserved. He's already frozen her accounts, Trent gloated, pushing off the car and taking a slow, arrogant step toward me. He's got a judge reviewing the conservatorship papers right now. By the end of the week, your mother will be legally declared incompetent, and you'll be facing a mountain of civil lawsuits for battery trespassing and elder endangerment. You're finished, Megan. You have no money, no leverage, and very soon you won't even have a career. You think a judge is going to ignore the fact that he was forcing her to sign those documents? I asked, feeding their arrogance, prompting them to reveal their strategy. What documents? Ashlyn asked, feigning innocent confusion before her sneer deepened. Dad says you were hallucinating. He says you broke in screaming about conspiracies. And guess what? Trent and I were right there. We saw the whole thing. We're going to testify that you attacked him unprovoked while your poor, confused mother watched. You're going to commit perjury, I stated flatly. We're going to protect our family, Trent corrected, taking another step forward. We're going to protect the company. You think you can just swoop in and disrupt our lives? We've spent the last 3 years restructuring that business. We've modernized it. We've made it profitable. You mean you've been draining it? I countered, ensuring the recording captured the specific nature of their involvement. You've been funneling her money into your own pockets. Trent laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. He was entirely too confident, entirely too convinced of his own untouchability. Oh, Megan, you're so naive. You think this is just about taking a salary. Dad is a visionary. He saw the potential in Susan's outdated little logistics firm. We just optimized the cash flow. Optimized, I repeated, by transferring millions into offshore accounts, by using shell companies to hide the embezzlement. Ashlyn stepped up beside her brother, her eyes flashing with triumphant malice. You can't prove a thing. Dad's lawyers have buried the paper trail so deep it would take a decade to unravel. And even if you could, the money is already gone. We initiated the final transfers this morning, right after the injunction went through. The funds are resting comfortably in accounts located in jurisdictions that do not cooperate with U.S. federal subpoenas. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. You see, Megan, we didn't just freeze Susan's accounts, we emptied the corporate reserves. The company is a hollow shell. By the time you find a lawyer willing to take your pro bono case, there won't be a single dime left to fight over. We've secured our future. You and Susan get to share a cheap motel room until the eviction notice arrives. I looked at them, absorbing the sheer magnitude of their stupidity. They were so desperate to humiliate me, so eager to boast about their perceived victory, that they were openly confessing to massive federal financial crimes on a public street. They believed their father's wealth shielded them from consequences. They believed the law only applied to people who couldn't afford expensive attorneys. So you admit that you and Trent are actively involved in moving stolen corporate funds to offshore accounts to evade U.S. jurisdiction? I asked, framing the question clearly for the recording. Trent rolled his eyes, clearly annoyed by my persistence. I admit that I'm smarter than you. I admit that I'm richer than you. I admit that I'm going to enjoy watching you lose everything because you couldn't just stay out of our way. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a sleek modern smartphone. He tapped the screen a few times, then held it up, displaying a digital banking interface. The screen showed a balance in the tens of millions held in a bank located in a well-known tax haven. Take a good look, Megan, Trent sneered, shoving the screen toward my face. This is what power looks like. This is what winning looks like. You can play soldier all you want, but real wars are fought with capital, and we have all of it. I looked at the screen, committing the account number and the bank's name to memory. I didn't need a photograph. My training had refined my visual recall to an eidetic level. I held his gaze, my expression remaining completely neutral. You really think you've won? I said softly. We have won, Ashlyn stated emphatically. Dad is taking over as CEO at the shareholder gala on Friday. He's going to announce Susan's retirement due to her declining health. The board is already in his pocket. It's a done deal. You have 72 hours before the takeover is official and irreversible. So enjoy your coffee, Megan. It's probably the last luxury you'll be able to afford. Trent chuckled, sliding his phone back into his pocket. Let's go, Ash. We have a fitting for the gala. I want to look my best when I officially become an executive vice president. They turned away, their posture radiating smug satisfaction. They walked back to the sports car, their laughter carrying over the cold morning air. I watched as Trent slid into the driver's seat, revving the engine unnecessarily loudly before tearing away from the curb, leaving a faint cloud of exhaust in their wake. I stood on the sidewalk, the cold wind whipping around me, and I smiled. It wasn't a smile of amusement. It was a cold, predatory grimace. They had come here to break my spirit, to assert their dominance. Instead, they had handed me the exact tactical intelligence I needed to annihilate them. I reached into my pocket and deactivated the recording. I had high-quality audio of Trent and Ashlyn admitting to perjury, extortion, wire fraud, and the illegal transfer of stolen corporate funds to specific offshore jurisdictions. I had the name of the bank and the account number. I had the timeline for the final phase of their hostile takeover. They thought they were playing chess. They didn't realize I was calling in an airstrike. I turned and walked back toward my apartment building, bypassing the cafe entirely. I didn't need coffee anymore. The adrenaline surging through my system was more potent than caffeine. The objective was clear, the target was acquired, and the enemy had just provided their exact coordinates. I pulled out my phone and dialed Jax's secure number. He answered on the first ring. Tell me you have good news, Jax said, his voice sharp and alert. I have better than good news, I replied, my pace quickening as I approached my building. I have a full confession, a timeline, and a routing number to an offshore account containing the stolen liquidity. How the hell did you get that? Jax asked, genuine surprise breaking through his usual stoicism. They drove to my apartment to brag about it, I said, a dark chuckle escaping me. They couldn't resist gloating. Never underestimate the tactical advantage of human stupidity, Jax noted dryly. Get back here. We have work to do. I'm on my way, I said, ending the call. The defensive phase was officially over. Trent and Ashlyn had just confirmed that Bradley's operation was vulnerable, reliant on a narrow window of execution, and the arrogant assumption that I was powerless to stop it. They believed they held the high ground. I was about to show them what happened when the ground simply disappeared beneath their feet. I walked through the reinforced steel door of my apartment, and the transformation of the space immediately hit me. My minimalist living room had been entirely repurposed into a tactical operations center. 3 high-definition monitors were mounted on the main wall, displaying cascading lines of encrypted data and global financial routing maps. Thick black cables snaked across the hardwood floor, connecting high processing servers to a centralized secure router. The coffee table had been pushed aside to make room for a massive whiteboard currently blank, but waiting to be filled. Jack sat in the center of the technological web, his fingers flying across a mechanical keyboard with blinding speed. I had served with Jax in 2 different combat zones. He was a former military intelligence analyst who specialized in dismantling terrorist financial networks and tracking hostile funding across international borders. He possessed a mind that saw the world entirely in numbers, patterns, and vulnerabilities. After leaving the military, he had transitioned into private sector cybersecurity, but his loyalty to our old unit remained absolute. When I called him, he did not ask questions. He simply packed his gear and arrived. My mother was sitting on a stool at the kitchen island, a cup of untouched tea in her hands. She stared at the screens and the blinking servers with a mixture of awe and residual shock. She had spent her life in corporate boardrooms, dealing with traditional accountants and polite lawyers. She was currently watching a modern digital war machine being assembled in her daughter's U.S. living room. I set my keys on the counter and pulled the secured tactical phone from my pocket. "You got the audio?" Jax asked, not taking his eyes off the center monitor. "I have the audio, the bank name, and the exact routing number," I replied, walking over to his workstation. Trent practically shoved the digital ledger into my face. He wanted to make sure I knew exactly how badly they were beating us. Jax let out a short, sharp laugh. "That level of narcissism is a tactical liability. Plug the device into the localized secure port. Let us see what kind of rope they just handed us to hang them with." I connected the phone to his isolated terminal. Jax ran a rapid security sweep on the file to ensure it carried no localized tracking malware, then extracted the raw audio. He enhanced the vocal frequencies, filtering out the street noise and the wind. Trent and Ashlyn U.S. voices filled the apartment crystal clear and dripping with arrogant malice. My mother flinched as she heard Trent boast about the offshore transfers and the impending hostile takeover of her company. Her hands gripped the edge of the kitchen island. I moved to her side, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Listen to what they are saying, Mom," I instructed, my voice calm. "Do not listen to the insults. Listen to the strategic confession. They just admitted to federal wire fraud on a recorded line." Jax paused the playback, his eyes gleaming, reflecting the blue light of the monitors. "Megan, this is pure gold," he stated. "They just provided the exact timeline for the asset transfer. But more importantly, you memorized the account number. Give it to me." I recited the 12-digit alphanumeric sequence from memory, followed by the name of the offshore bank Ashlyn had bragged about. Jax typed the information into a specialized terminal. "Normally, tracking this kind of capital flight through legal channels would take months," he explained, his fingers moving rapidly. "We would have to file subpoenas, deal with international banking jurisdictions, and fight Bradley U.S. corporate lawyers at every single step. By the time a judge granted us access, the money would be bounced through 10 different countries and completely scrubbed." "We are not using standard legal routes," I stated, watching the progress bar on his screen. "We are treating Bradley Vance as a hostile foreign asset. We bypass the red tape." "Exactly," Jax agreed. "We go through the back door. I am initiating a deep dive forensic audit of his entire digital life." Jax utilized a suite of gray area intelligence tools. He deployed specialized scraping algorithms designed to hunt through the darkest corners of the financial web. He was not hacking the bank directly, which would trigger international security protocols. Instead, he was tracking the digital exhaust left behind by the transactions. Every time money moved, it created a tiny ripple in the global routing system. Jax knew exactly how to track those ripples back to their source. For the next 4 hours, the apartment was silent, except for the rhythmic clacking of the keyboard and the low hum of the servers. I stood beside Jax, acting as the operational director, analyzing the data packets as he pulled them down. My mother watched us, her fear slowly transforming into a grim, determined fascination. "Got a ping," Jax announced, suddenly hitting a key to isolate a specific data stream. "The offshore account you memorized was established 3 weeks ago. The primary signatory is a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands, but look at the secondary routing authorization." He pulled up a hidden corporate registry document. The shell corporation was completely anonymous on paper, but the digital footprint of the registration fee led straight back to an IP address located inside Bradley U.S. private study. He registered the offshore shell company from his home network, I noted, feeling a surge of predatory satisfaction. He was lazy. "He got comfortable," Jax corrected. "He has been stealing from your mother for so long without facing any resistance that his operational security has completely degraded. He thought nobody was looking." Jax continued to pull on that single digital thread, unraveling the entire sweater. He traced the IP address outward, mapping the flow of capital. The monitors displayed a growing web of interconnected nodes. We watched in real time as the stolen liquidity from my mother U.S. logistics company was fractured into dozens of smaller payments. Those payments were funneled through fake consulting firms controlled by Trent and Ashlyn, then recombined and pushed overseas into the Cayman account. "We need to map the entire network," I ordered, bringing a large marker to the whiteboard. "We need every name, every corrupt doctor, and every complicit board member." Jax nodded, executing a sweeping search across Bradley U.S. communication logs. By cross-referencing the financial transfers with intercepted metadata, we began connecting the faces to the crimes. The whiteboard quickly filled with a sprawling, complex diagram of Bradley U.S. criminal enterprise. I wrote Bradley East's name at the top center, circling it in red. From there, I drew lines downward to Trent and Ashlyn, identifying them as willing co-conspirators in money laundering and wire fraud. "We found the doctors," Jack stated, pulling up a series of substantial recurring payments disguised as charitable donations. "Dr. Robert Evans and Dr. William Cho. Bradley has been funneling $50,000 a quarter to their private clinics. In exchange, they provided the fraudulent medical affidavits claiming your mother had early-onset dementia." I added their names to the board, connecting them directly to the elder abuse and extortion charges. These were the men who had violated their medical oaths to help Bradley construct a psychological prison for my mother. They would lose their licenses, their practices, and their freedom. The network expanded further. We identified 3 key board members within my mother U.S. logistics company who were actively facilitating the hostile takeover. Bradley had essentially bribed them with guaranteed stock options and massive payout packages, ensuring they would vote to remove my mother due to her fabricated health issues at the upcoming gala. "This is not just domestic abuse," I said, stepping back to look at the completed whiteboard. "The scale of this operation crosses multiple federal jurisdictions. We are looking at a highly organized criminal syndicate." Jax leaned back in his chair, rubbing his tired eyes. "You were right to bypass the local police, Megan. Chief Miller is on this payroll too. Look at this." He pulled up a digital ledger showing regular, untraceable cash deposits made to a political action committee controlled entirely by the local police chief. It was the exact reason Bradley felt so confident calling the cops on me during the breach. He had purchased his own personal law enforcement shield. My mother walked over to the whiteboard, staring at the sheer volume of betrayal mapped out in black and red marker. Her entire life, her business, her health, and her friendships had been systematically dismantled and monetized by the man she married. "He really thought I was just a stupid, weak woman," she said, her voice completely devoid of its previous fragility. "He thought he could steal my life and I would just fade away into an institution. He severely miscalculated," I told her. "He built this entire network on the assumption that you had no one to fight for you. He did not account for us." Jax finalized the data compilation, packaging the raw intelligence into a highly encrypted digital dossier. The file contained every forged signature, every illegal offshore transfer, the audio confession from Trent and Ashlyn, and the undeniable proof of the medical bribery. It was a perfectly constructed lethal weapon of legal and financial destruction. We have the entire blueprint, Jax confirmed, tapping the heavy glass monitor. We know exactly how he moves his money, and we know exactly who is helping him do it. The audit is complete. I stared at the intricate web of corruption on the whiteboard. The intelligence gathering phase was finished. We possessed absolute, undeniable proof of massive federal crimes. Now it was time to weaponize that intelligence. Bradley Vance operated under the assumption that his wealth made him invincible. He believed his upcoming shareholder gala would serve as his ultimate coronation. We are going to use this network against him. I stated my tactical plan fully formed. We are going to isolate him from his investors, create mass panic within his ranks, and force him to accelerate his timeline. We make him desperate, and when he steps up to the podium on Friday night believing he has finally won, we drop the hammer. Jack smiled a cold, professional expression. I will begin preparing the targeted data packets. We go on the offensive. The living room had transformed from a quiet domestic space into a war room capable of tearing down a corporate empire. Bradley thought he had effectively neutralized the threat by freezing bank accounts. He was completely unaware that a precision-guided munition had just been armed, locked onto his coordinates, and was currently waiting for my command to launch. Jax did not stop at the Cayman Island accounts. He was a bloodhound who had just caught a fresh scent, and he knew exactly how to track the blood trail. He isolated the primary routing numbers from the offshore banks and cross-referenced them with my mother's logistics company vendor payment database. The high-capacity servers in my living room whirred louder, processing terabytes of corporate financial history in a matter of seconds. I handed my mother a fresh cup of hot tea, watching her physical posture transform. The fragile, terrified woman I had extracted from the mansion was gone. In her place sat the brilliant founder who had built a national supply chain empire from a single warehouse. She set the tea down immediately and walked closer to the monitors, her eyes tracking the cascading numbers with sudden sharp clarity. "Stop right there," Susan commanded, pointing a shaking but fiercely determined finger at the secondary screen. Jax froze the data stream. She pointed to a series of massive recurring payments issued to a vendor named Apex Global Solutions. "That is impossible," she stated. "Bradley authorized these payments for international freight forwarding, but our company only operates domestically. We sold off our international freight division 4 years ago. There is absolutely no legitimate reason we would be paying a vendor for overseas shipping." Jax highlighted the vendor name and ran a rapid background trace. "Apex Global Solutions is not a freight company," he announced, his voice laced with grim satisfaction. "It is a paper entity registered in Delaware. The listed CEO is a corporate proxy, but the primary shareholder is Trent Vance." He pulled up a second vendor labeled Vanguard Operations. "Vanguard bills your company $80,000 a month for logistical software maintenance," Jax noted. "But the IP addresses pinging the maintenance servers are entirely dead. It is ghost traffic. The registered owner of Vanguard is Ashlyn Vance." The tactical picture shifted violently. Bradley was not just siphoning money to fund a lavish lifestyle. He was operating a highly sophisticated corporate fraud ring. He was using the legitimate infrastructure of my mother's logistics empire to wash dirty money. Trent and Ashlyn were not just spoiled trust fund kids living off their father. They were active accomplices, managing the shell corporations that generated fake invoices for ghost services. Bradley approved the fraudulent invoices from the inside, pushing clean corporate funds out to his children, who then routed the money offshore. "It is a classic wash cycle," I said, studying the digital flow on the monitors. "He drains the company liquidity under the guise of operational expenses. It makes the company look less profitable to the legitimate shareholders, intentionally driving down the stock value. That justifies his narrative that the company is failing under your leadership, Mom. It perfectly sets the stage for his hostile takeover. He plays the savior stepping in to rescue a failing business while secretly being the parasite bleeding it dry." Jax cracked his knuckles, leaning closer to the screens. "It gets worse," he said. I am looking at the deposit history for Trent and Ashland's shell corporations. The money coming in from your mother's company only accounts for about 40% of their total revenue. There is outside capital flowing into these shells, massive amounts of it. Where is it coming from? I asked, my tactical instincts flaring. Jax ran a secondary decryption protocol, the screen filled with international wire transfers originating from a series of holding companies in Eastern Europe and South America. Bradley is not just embezzling from his wife, Jack stated, turning his chair to face me. He is running a full-scale international money laundering operation. He is using Susan's legitimate logistics contracts to mix dirty foreign capital with clean domestic revenue. Trent and Ashland filter the foreign money through their fake consulting firms. Bradley integrates it into the logistics company ledgers as investment capital, and then it all gets washed out to the Cayman accounts as clean corporate profit. The air in the apartment grew thick with the weight of the discovery. This was no longer a domestic dispute over a conservatorship or a stolen inheritance. This was a multi-million-dollar federal crime. Bradley had crossed the line into Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act territory. He was facing decades in a maximum security federal penitentiary. My mother stared at the screen, her fists clenched so tightly, her knuckles were stark white. He turned my life's work into a criminal enterprise, she whispered, her voice shaking with absolute rage. He used my name. He used the company I built to wash money for criminals. He made a fatal error, I told her, keeping my voice steady to anchor her anger. He put his arrogant idiot children in charge of the primary laundering nodes. Trent and Ashland do not have the operational discipline to run a secure financial cartel. They bragged about the offshore accounts on a public street. They drove a flashy sports car bought with dirty money straight to my apartment. They handed us the keys to the entire kingdom because they were too busy gloating to check their six. We need to secure the internal ledgers, I said, turning back to Jax. Can you access the logistics company's main server from here? Jax shook his head. Bradley locked down the administrative privileges when he fired the executive board. I can see the money leaving the accounts, but I cannot access the internal approval signatures without triggering a massive cybersecurity alarm. If he knows we are in the system, he will start burning the physical evidence. My mother stepped forward. I can get you in, she stated. I looked at her, surprised. I thought Bradley revoked all your digital access. He revoked my primary credentials, she said, a fierce, determined light burning in her eyes. He took my phone and my laptop. But I built the digital architecture for that company 20 years ago. When we upgraded the servers, I insisted on maintaining a hardwired backdoor access protocol for absolute emergencies. A ghost account that does not show up on any administrative audit. Bradley is a corporate raider. He only understands surface-level operations. He knows absolutely nothing about the underlying code. She walked over to Jax's terminal. Let me drive, she ordered. Jax slid his chair back with a respectful nod, allowing my mother to take the keyboard. Her fingers moved with surprising agility, executing a series of complex command prompts that bypassed the modern security interface entirely. She was dialing directly into the foundational framework of the corporate network she had built from scratch. Within 3 minutes, she bypassed Bradley's firewalls. The screen flooded with internal corporate communications, unredacted financial ledgers, and digital signature logs. I have the approval chain, she announced, her voice ringing with profound vindication. Every single fraudulent invoice submitted by Trent and Ashland. Every single one of them was personally authorized and signed by Bradley. He bypassed the accounting department entirely, using his emergency executive powers to force the payments through. Jax rapidly downloaded the entire cache of internal documents, securing them on our encrypted drives. We have the smoking gun, he confirmed. We have the motive, the method, and the undeniable proof of execution. I looked at the whiteboard, which was now completely covered in red marker lines, mapping out a massive criminal conspiracy. The stakes had fundamentally shifted. We were no longer just fighting to save my mother's money or keep her out of a psychiatric facility. We were armed with enough actionable intelligence to tear down an international money laundering syndicate. Bradley Vance thought he was playing a localized game of domestic manipulation. He thought freezing my mother's bank accounts was a masterstroke of legal strategy. He had absolutely no idea that his actions had triggered a full-scale forensic investigation into his most heavily guarded secrets. "We have enough to go to the FBI right now," Jack said, leaning back in his chair. "We hand this dossier to the Financial Crimes Division, and they will raid his house before sunrise." I shook my head, my tactical plan solidifying into a cold, calculated strategy. "No," I commanded. "If we go to the FBI now, Bradley will hire his army of lawyers to stall the investigation. He will claim ignorance. He will throw Trent and Ashlyn under the bus and say they orchestrated the fraud without his knowledge. He will tie the federal agents up in jurisdictional red tape for years while he hides his remaining assets. We do not just hand the government a file, we hand them a public execution." "When is the annual shareholder gala?" I asked my mother. "This Friday evening," she replied without hesitation. "He sent out the invitations weeks ago. It is a massive black tie event at the downtown ballroom. That is where he plans to officially announce my retirement and his appointment as the undisputed chief executive officer. He is gathering all the primary investors, all the board members, and the entire corporate leadership team into one room." I noted the pieces falling perfectly into place. "He wants a coronation. We are going to give him a tribunal." I turned to Jax. "We need to prepare the digital payload. I want every offshore account, every forged signature, and every piece of the audio confession formatted into a high-resolution presentation. When Bradley steps up to that podium on Friday night believing he has won everything, we are going to burn his empire to the ground while the whole city watches." The execution phase of the operation began before the sun even fully crested over the city skyline. I stood by the window of my apartment watching the morning traffic slowly build on the streets below. My mind was sharp-focused and entirely devoid of the paralyzing anxiety my mother was currently experiencing. I had spent years learning how to destabilize hostile regimes and dismantle entrenched power structures. Bradley Vance was about to learn that corporate raiding was child's play compared to asymmetrical psychological warfare. Jax and I had spent the remainder of the night constructing the perfect digital payload. We did not send the entire dossier. That would be a strategic error. Dropping all the evidence at once would allow Bradley to assess the total damage and formulate a comprehensive defense. Instead, we opted for a slow, agonizing bleed. We engineered a series of highly targeted anonymous data leaks designed specifically to fracture his foundation of power, his investor confidence. We compiled a concise, irrefutable document detailing just one specific offshore transfer connected to Vanguard Operations Ashland's shell company. We included the IP address routing logs proving the transfer originated from Bradley's home network, and the digital signature confirming he had bypassed the corporate accounting department to authorize it. It was just enough blood in the water to attract the sharks. "Who is his biggest, most ruthless investor?" I asked my mother, who was now sitting at the kitchen island reviewing the hard copy files we had printed. Susan didn't hesitate. "Richard Sterling," she replied, her voice steadying as she leaned into her role as the ousted CEO. "He runs a massive private equity firm in New York. Bradley has been courting him for months, trying to secure a $50 million capital injection to fund an aggressive expansion of his own real estate portfolio. Sterling is notoriously paranoid about compliance. He will not tolerate even the scent of federal financial impropriety." "Target acquired," I stated. "Jax, send the packet. Route it through a secure proxy server in Geneva. Make sure it lands directly in Richard Sterling's personal encrypted inbox." Jax hit the execute key. "Payload delivered," he confirmed, leaning back in his chair. Now we wait for the shockwave. We didn't have to wait long. I had Jax tap into the communication infrastructure of Bradley's corporate office, intercepting metadata without alerting their internal security. Less than 2 hours after the Geneva proxy delivered the file, the digital activity surrounding Bradley's office erupted. We watched the visual representation of the traffic on the monitors. A massive spike in secure phone calls and encrypted emails flooded Bradley's direct lines. The visual data showed the panic spreading in real time. "He just got the call," Jax narrated, his eyes tracking the frantic digital patterns. "Sterling's office just initiated a priority 1 connection with Bradley's executive assistant. They are demanding an immediate explanation for the offshore transfer anomaly. I crossed my arms, feeling a grim satisfaction. Bradley's arrogance was his fatal flaw. He believed his power was absolute because he had never faced an adversary capable of striking him where he felt safest. He thought he was insulated by his wealth and his lawyers. He was currently discovering that those defenses were entirely useless against an invisible enemy who possessed superior intelligence capabilities. The panic began to cascade down the organizational chart. Within an hour, we tracked urgent communications from Bradley's office to Trent and Ashland's personal devices. The frantic pacing of the calls painted a clear picture. Bradley was demanding answers, demanding to know how a highly confidential offshore transfer had been intercepted and leaked to his most critical investor. Trent is calling him back. Jax reported monitoring the encrypted cellular traffic. The call duration is short, less than 45 seconds. Trent is likely denying any breach on his end. He does not have the technical competence to realize his network has been compromised. I paced the living room, analyzing the unfolding tactical situation. We had successfully disrupted his primary funding source and injected severe paranoia into his inner circle. Bradley was now fighting a war on two fronts, managing the sudden catastrophic collapse of his investor confidence while simultaneously trying to finalize the hostile takeover of my mother's logistics company. He is going to accelerate his timeline, I predicted, turning to face my mother and Jax. He just lost $50 million in private equity capital. Sterling will pull his investments immediately, and he will likely warn his peers. Bradley's access to clean, legitimate credit is rapidly evaporating. He needs liquidity, and he needs it immediately to stop his entire empire from collapsing. Susan nodded, her expression hardening. The logistics company, she confirmed. The corporate reserves. He needs to drain the remaining operational capital to cover his margins and silence the panicked investors. But he cannot legally touch the primary corporate accounts without officially being appointed as the undisputed chief executive officer. Which brings us back to the shareholder gala on Friday night, I stated, tapping the whiteboard. The gala was originally meant to be his coronation, a lavish public display of his corporate dominance. Now it is an act of sheer desperate survival. He has to push the hostile takeover through. He has to convince the shareholders and the board members that you are medically unfit and that he is the only one capable of steering the company through this sudden, unexplained financial turbulence. The monitors flared again, drawing Jax's attention. I have movement, he announced, his fingers flying across the keyboard to isolate the new data stream. Bradley just authorized an emergency release of funds. He is pulling capital from his personal accounts, the ones he has not locked down in the offshore shells. Where's the money going? I asked, moving closer to the screen. Jax traced the routing numbers. He is paying off the compromised board members, the ones who are supposed to vote in his favor at the gala. He is essentially bribing them to expedite the leadership transition and ignore the sudden red flags. The payments are categorized as emergency consulting bonuses. I smiled, a cold, humorless expression. He is bleeding out and he knows it. He is trying to buy loyalty because he has nothing else left to offer. He is terrified. We spent the next 48 hours maintaining the psychological pressure. We did not leak any more documents. The silence was far more effective than continuous attacks. Bradley was left to agonize over who possessed the damaging information and what they planned to do with it. He was shadowboxing an enemy he could not see and could not intimidate. Through Jax's continued surveillance, we watched Bradley's carefully constructed world begin to fracture. We intercepted frantic communications between his high-priced corporate lawyers. They were scrambling to contain the fallout from Richard Sterling's sudden withdrawal, attempting to draft non-disclosure agreements and threaten litigation against anonymous whistleblowers. They were completely ineffective. You cannot sue a ghost. Trent and Ashland were equally panicked. Their luxurious, insulated lives were suddenly threatened by the very real possibility of federal investigation. We tracked encrypted messages between the siblings, arguing over who was responsible for the security breach and discussing desperate plans to move more money out of the country before the authorities caught wind of the operation. They are turning on each other, Jax observed, reading a particularly volatile exchange between Trent and Ashland. The stress is fracturing their alliance. They are realizing that their father's protection might not be absolute. Let them panic, I commanded. Let them exhaust their resources trying to plug holes in a sinking ship. We maintain our focus on the primary objective, the gala. It was Thursday evening, 24 hours before the shareholder event. The atmosphere in my apartment was charged with kinetic anticipation. We had successfully destabilized the target, isolated his resources, and forced him into a desperate reactive posture. Bradley Vance was walking into the ballroom tomorrow night, believing it was his only remaining path to salvation. He believed he could still salvage his empire by sacrificing my mother's legacy. I stood before the whiteboard reviewing the tactical layout for the final phase of the operation. The intelligence gathering was complete. The psychological warfare had been flawlessly executed. The battlefield had been prepared entirely on my terms. I turned to my mother, who was reviewing the final draft of the digital dossier we had compiled. She looked strong, resolute, and completely free of the fear that had paralyzed her just days ago. She was ready to reclaim her life. "Mom," I said, my voice steady and commanding, "tomorrow night we do not just stop the takeover, we do not just expose the fraud. We are going to permanently dismantle his ability to ever hurt anyone again. We are going to ensure that when he walks out of that ballroom, he walks directly into federal custody." Susan looked up from the documents, her eyes locking onto mine with absolute conviction. "I am ready, Megan," she stated, her voice unwavering. "Let us finish this." I nodded, turning back to Jax, who was running final encryption protocols on the presentation files. The quiet daughter had successfully lured the arrogant predator into the kill zone. The trap was set, and the trigger was primed. Bradley Vance had 48 hours left to enjoy his stolen wealth and his unearned power. The countdown to his absolute public destruction had officially begun. The grand ballroom of the Sinclair Hotel was a testament to the kind of wealth that demands an audience. Crystal chandeliers, massive and intricate, threw fractured light across the polished marble floors. A string quartet played near the entrance, their music a soft underscore to the low hum of conversation. Waiters moved silently through the crowd, carrying silver trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. This was the pinnacle of corporate society, a gathering of the city's most influential investors, board members, and executives. Bradley Vance stood near the front of the room holding court. He wore a custom tuxedo, his posture radiating a forced, practiced ease. To the casual observer, he was the picture of a successful, commanding leader. But a closer inspection revealed the subtle cracks in his facade. He was checking his watch too frequently. His smile, usually broad and confident, was tight at the corners. He was sweating despite the climate-controlled air of the ballroom. Trent and Ashlyn flanked him, playing their roles as the supportive, grieving children. Ashlyn wore a gown that cost more than a mid-sized car, her diamonds catching the light. She laughed at a joke made by a junior executive, but her eyes were restless, darting toward the ballroom doors. Trent held a glass of scotch, trying to project an air of sophisticated boredom, but his knuckles were white where he gripped the glass. They were all feeling the immense pressure of the invisible vice I had tightened around them over the last 48 hours. Richard Sterling, the private equity titan, had indeed pulled his $50 million. Furthermore, the rumors we had planted were spreading like a virus through the financial sector. Bradley had spent the entire day frantically calling board members, promising exorbitant bonuses and assuring them that the company's liquidity was secure. He had depleted the last of his accessible personal funds to bribe the necessary votes for tonight's announcement. He was all in. If he didn't secure the CEO position tonight, if he didn't gain absolute legal control over my mother's company, his empire would collapse by Monday morning. I was not in the ballroom. Not yet. I was currently positioned in a soundproof security control room adjacent to the main hall, monitoring the event through the hotel's closed-circuit camera system. Jack sat beside me, his hands resting lightly on a keyboard connected to a specialized terminal he had hardwired into the hotel's audiovisual network. We had bypassed the hotel's IT department, entirely establishing direct control over the main presentation screens and the primary audio feed. "Are the federal agents in position?" I asked, my voice calm, maintaining strict operational discipline. Jax checked a secondary monitor displaying a grid of GPS tracking markers. They are stacked in the service corridor just outside the main kitchen, two agents from the Financial Crimes Division plus a team of forensic auditors. They are holding for your signal. I looked at the primary monitor, watching Bradley shake hands with an older board member. He was laying the groundwork, weaving his narrative of a tragic declining wife and a reluctant but necessary transfer of power. He believed he was moments away from executing the perfect corporate coup. "He is moving to the podium," Jax announced, tapping a key to enlarge the feed from the central camera. Bradley walked up the short steps to the raised stage at the front of the ballroom. The string quartet stopped playing. The low hum of conversation faded as attendees turned their attention to the front. Trent and Ashlyn moved to stand directly behind him, presenting a unified family front. Bradley tapped the microphone, a sharp sound that echoed through the massive room. He looked out over the crowd, taking a slow, deep breath, preparing to deliver the performance of his life. "Good evening, everyone," Bradley began, his voice dropping into a solemn, respectful register. "Thank you all for being here tonight. Usually this annual gala is a time for celebration, a time to look back on a year of unprecedented growth and look forward to even greater achievements." He paused, lowering his head slightly, a masterclass in manufactured grief. "But tonight my heart is heavy. As many of you know, my wife Susan, the founder and visionary behind this incredible company, has been struggling." He let the silence hang, allowing the audience to absorb the implication. "It has been a difficult year for our family. Susan's health, specifically her cognitive health, has deteriorated rapidly. It breaks my heart to say this, but she is no longer capable of managing the day-to-day operations of the logistics empire she built." I watched him on the monitor, feeling a surge of cold fury. He was standing there wearing a suit bought with her money, using her fabricated illness to steal her legacy. In light of these tragic circumstances, Bradley continued, his tone shifting from mournful to resolute. "The board of directors and I have had to make some very difficult decisions regarding the future of the company. We cannot allow Susan's legacy to falter. We must ensure stability for our investors, our employees, and our partners." He looked directly at a cluster of board members near the front, the men he had bribed just hours ago. "Therefore, effective immediately, Susan will be stepping down. The board has voted to grant me full executive authority. I will be assuming the role of chief executive officer." A smattering of polite, subdued applause rippled through the room. It was the sound of a corporate transition being accepted as a tragic necessity. Bradley smiled, a brief, triumphant flash of teeth. He believed he had done it. He believed he had won. "Jax," I said, not taking my eyes off the monitor. "Are we synced with the main projector?" "We have complete system override." Jax confirmed, his fingers hovering over the execute key. "The payload is primed." I stood up, adjusting the collar of my uniform. The dark blue fabric of the army dress uniform was immaculate, the metals gleaming under the fluorescent lights of the control room. I wasn't just a daughter returning to confront a stepfather. I was an officer of the United States military, and I was about to execute a hostile target. "Launch it," I commanded. Jax hit the key. In the ballroom, Bradley opened his mouth to continue his speech. "I want to assure you all that under my leadership," he was cut off, not by a person, but by a sound. A sharp, high-decibel electronic tone blasted through the ballroom's massive speaker system, overriding Bradley's microphone entirely. The sound was jarring, designed to instantly shatter the carefully cultivated atmosphere of the gala. The guests flinched, some covering their ears. Bradley tapped his microphone, his brow furrowing in confusion. He looked off stage, gesturing angrily toward the hotel's audiovisual technicians, assuming it was a technical glitch. It was not a glitch. The massive high-definition presentation screen behind the podium, which had previously displayed the company logo, suddenly went black. A second later, the screen flared to life, illuminating the entire front of the room. It was not a PowerPoint presentation about quarterly earnings. It was a digital dossier. The first slide was a stark, high-contrast image of a banking document. The header clearly displayed the logo of a Cayman Islands financial institution. Below it, highlighted in bright, unmistakable red, was a routing number and a staggering account balance: $42 million. The murmurs in the crowd stopped instantly. The silence in the ballroom became absolute, thick with sudden, crushing tension. The city's financial elite were staring at a blatant, undeniable record of offshore capital flight. Bradley turned around to look at the screen. The color drained from his face so fast it looked like a physical blow. He stood frozen, staring at the numbers he thought he had buried so deeply they would never see the light of day. "Turn it off!" he yelled, his voice cracking with sudden, uncontrolled panic. He waved frantically at the back of the room. I said, "Turn the screen off." The audiovisual technicians scrambled, but their controls were completely dead. Jax had locked them out of their own system. The slide on the screen transitioned. The new image was a highly detailed organizational chart. It showed Susan's logistics company at the top. Below it, clear, thick lines connected the corporate accounts directly to Vanguard Operations and Apex Global Solutions. The crowd, filled with experienced investors and auditors, recognized exactly what they were looking at. It was the blueprint for a massive money laundering operation. Trent and Ashlyn, standing behind their father, finally turned to look at the screen. Ashlyn gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Trent took a step back, his eyes wide with terror as he saw his own name listed as the primary shareholder of a fraudulent shell company. The final slide transitioned. It was an audio waveform graphic. The speakers, which had been silent for 10 seconds, suddenly crackled to life. The audio was crisp, enhanced by Jax's filters. The voices echoed through the massive ballroom, impossible to misunderstand or ignore. We didn't just freeze Susan's accounts. It was Ashlyn's voice, arrogant and dripping with malice. We emptied the corporate reserves. The company is a hollow shell. By the time you find a lawyer willing to take your pro bono case, there won't be a single dime left to fight over. We've secured our future. The recording continued, seamless and damning. I admit that I'm smarter than you. Trent's voice followed, sneering and boastful. I admit that I'm richer than you. I admit that I'm going to enjoy watching you lose everything. The ballroom erupted. Investors were shouting. Board members were pulling out their phones, frantically calling their legal teams. The carefully orchestrated coronation had instantly transformed into a chaotic, very public execution. Bradley stood at the podium, completely paralyzed. His empire, his reputation, his freedom, everything he had stolen and built was disintegrating in front of his eyes. He looked out at the crowd, searching for an ally, for someone to intervene. But the investors he had courted were now looking at him with absolute, unadulterated revulsion. I stepped out of the control room and walked down the short hallway leading to the main ballroom doors. I didn't rush. The pacing was deliberate. The enemy was routed. The defensive lines were shattered. All that remained was the final devastating breach. I reached the heavy double doors at the back of the ballroom. I didn't knock. I didn't wait for an invitation. I placed my hands flat against the polished wood and pushed them open. The heavy oak doors swung inward, hitting the brass stops with a resonant thud that echoed across the cavernous ballroom. The chaotic murmur of panicked investors and frantic board members died instantly. A profound, suffocating silence swept over the room, replacing the uproar caused by the audio playback. Hundreds of heads turned simultaneously toward the back of the hall. I stood at the threshold, framed by the bright lights of the corridor behind me, no longer the invisible, frumpy stepdaughter they had dismissed for years. I was dressed in my pristine army service uniform. The dark blue jacket was perfectly tailored, the brass buttons catching the harsh glare of the chandeliers. The silver oak leaves of a lieutenant colonel rested heavily on my shoulders, and the multicolored ribbons of my deployment commendations sat aligned over my left breast pocket. The crisp, authoritative precision of the military uniform was a jarring, violent contrast to the sea of silk evening gowns and custom civilian tuxedos filling the room. I let my gaze sweep the expansive space, applying the same cold, tactical assessment I would use when entering a hostile combat zone. I registered the shock on the faces of the corporate elite, the sudden realization dawning in their eyes that the woman standing before them was not a grieving, confused family member, but a highly trained government asset. I did not walk alone. Flanking me on my right was Special Agent Reynolds, and on my left Special Agent Vance, both senior operatives from the Federal Bureau of Investigation Financial Crimes Division. They wore dark, sharply cut suits, their suit jackets intentionally unbuttoned to reveal the distinct heavy outline of their service weapons and the gold badges clipped securely to their belts. Behind them marched a strike team of 4 elite federal forensic auditors. These were not local cops easily swayed by a country club membership or a generous campaign donation. These were the apex predators of the financial justice system experts, who specialized in tearing apart international money laundering syndicates and dismantling corporate racketeering rings. They carried reinforced briefcases containing hard copies of the digital payload Jax had just broadcast, along with federal subpoenas and sealed arrest warrants authorized by a federal judge just 2 hours prior. Our synchronized footsteps echoed against the polished marble floor in a tight, disciplined cadence. The visual impact of our formation was undeniable. We were a physical manifestation of absolute legal and tactical authority descending upon a room built on fragile lies and stolen capital. The wealthy attendees, men and women who wielded massive influence in their respective industries, instinctively stepped backward, pressing themselves against the linen-draped tables to clear a wide path down the center aisle. I moved down the newly formed corridor of terrified elites with a slow, deliberate pace. I kept my posture rigidly straight, my chin parallel to the floor, and my eyes locked directly onto the target standing on the raised stage at the far end of the room. Whispers broke out among the crowd as we passed frantic, hushed voices trying to comprehend the magnitude of the invasion. I heard fragments of their panic as the financial titans realized the severity of the situation. They were connecting the devastating audio recording they had just heard to the heavily armed federal presence marching toward the podium. I ignored them entirely. My peripheral vision tracked the exits, noting the hotel security personnel standing frozen near the fire doors, completely unsure of how to handle a federal breach. The atmosphere in the room had shifted from a luxurious celebration of corporate power into the chilling claustrophobic air of a crime scene lockdown. No one dared to pull out a phone or make a sudden movement. The sheer gravitational pull of the federal agents kept the crowd entirely subdued. Every step I took toward the stage stripped away another layer of Bradley's fabricated empire. He had wanted a public coronation, a night where the entire city celebrated his genius. Instead, I had brought him a public tribunal completely inescapable and brutally final. On the stage, Bradley's initial paralysis finally broke, shattered by the visceral reality of armed federal agents marching toward him. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, pallid gray. Sweat poured down his forehead, soaking the expensive collar of his custom tuxedo shirt. His chest heaved with rapid, panicked breaths. He gripped the edges of the wooden podium so hard his knuckles turned stark white, as if the podium were a lifeboat in the middle of a hurricane. Desperation clawed its way up his throat. He looked wildly toward the side of the room where the hotel's private security detail was stationed. "Get them out!" Bradley screamed, his voice cracking devoid of its usual smooth corporate authority. "Security! I am the CEO of this company. I demand you remove these people from my private event immediately. This is a private function. Throw them out." The head of the hotel's security team, a burly man in a dark suit with an earpiece, took 2 hesitant steps forward, compelled by his job description to respond to the frantic demands of the client. He raised his hand, opening his mouth to issue a polite command to halt the advancing agents. Special Agent Reynolds did not even break his stride, without missing a single beat of our synchronized march. Reynolds reached to his belt, unclipped his solid gold shield, and thrust it directly into the line of sight of the approaching security director. "Federal Bureau of Investigation." Reynolds announced, his voice projecting across the silent ballroom with the concussive force of a physical blow. "This is an active federal operation executing sealed warrants for wire fraud, money laundering, and corporate extortion. Stand down immediately or you will be arrested for obstruction of a federal investigation." The security director froze as if he had run into a solid brick wall. He looked at the badge, looked at the heavy sidearm resting on Reynolds' hip, and then looked back at Bradley, sweating on the stage. The security director possessed the common sense that Bradley lacked. He instantly raised both hands in a gesture of total surrender, taking 3 rapid steps backward and signaling his entire team to stand down. He wanted absolutely no part of a federal takedown. Bradley watched his final line of defense evaporate in a matter of seconds. The illusion of his power was gone, replaced by the crushing, inescapable weight of federal jurisdiction. I continued my march, closing the final 30 feet between the audience and the raised platform. Behind Bradley, the arrogant facade of his children was disintegrating in real time. Ashlyn was trembling violently, her hands clutching the fabric of her designer gown, as if trying to shield herself from the impending catastrophe. The smug, condescending sneer she had worn outside my apartment was entirely gone, replaced by the raw, wide-eyed terror of a spoiled child, realizing that money could not buy her way out of federal prison. Trent looked like he was about to vomit. He kept glancing toward the service exit behind the stage, his eyes darting frantically as he calculated his chances of fleeing the building. Special Agent Vance saw the subtle shift in Trent's posture. Vance simply locked eyes with Trent and rested his right hand deliberately on the grip of his holstered weapon. The silent, lethal warning was universally understood. Trent froze in place, his shoulders slumping in total defeat. He knew running would only result in a public tackle and a pair of steel handcuffs. I reached the bottom of the short staircase leading up to the stage. My boots hit the carpeted steps with heavy, deliberate thuds. I did not rush. I climbed the stairs with the slow, measured confidence of an executioner ascending a scaffold. The two federal agents flanked the base of the stairs, establishing a secure perimeter that prevented anyone from entering or leaving the immediate vicinity of the podium. The team of forensic auditors fanned out toward the front row, holding their briefcases ready. I stepped onto the platform and stopped exactly 3 feet away from Bradley. The sheer proximity of my presence forced him to stagger backward, bumping awkwardly against the heavy wooden stand. He was shaking uncontrollably now, his breathing ragged and loud in the quiet room. He looked at my military uniform, at the silver oak leaves on my shoulders, and the horrific realization of his monumental miscalculation finally washed over him. He was completely defenseless, stripped of his corporate armor and left entirely exposed before the entire business community. I looked directly into his terrified eyes, showing him the absolute unwavering resolve of the quiet daughter he had foolishly decided to push too far. The trap had snapped completely shut, and there was absolutely nowhere left for him to hide or run. He was now completely cornered. I stepped forward, preparing to take the microphone directly from his trembling right hand. I reached out and wrapped my gloved hand firmly around the stem of the microphone, sliding it effortlessly from Bradley's slick, trembling fingers. He offered absolutely no physical resistance. His grip was entirely slack, his muscles rendered useless by the sudden massive influx of adrenaline and pure, unadulterated panic. With my left hand, I smoothly extracted the digital presentation clicker from his other palm. I stepped to the exact center of the podium, physically displacing him. Bradley stumbled backward, his expensive leather shoes scraping awkwardly against the carpeted stage until his back hit the heavy velvet curtain behind the platform. I looked out over the sea of horrified faces in the grand ballroom. The city's financial elite sat in stunned silence, their champagne glasses lowered, their eyes darting between my military uniform, the armed federal agents securing the perimeter, and the sweating, ruined man cowering behind me. I brought the microphone to my lips. My voice echoed through the massive speaker system, steady, authoritative, and completely devoid of the artificial warmth Bradley had used just moments before. "Good evening," I stated, my gaze sweeping across the front rows of the audience. "My name is Lieutenant Colonel Megan Hayes. I am the daughter of Susan Hayes, the true and sole founder of this logistics empire." The man cowering behind me just told you a highly fabricated, deeply disturbing story about my mother's declining cognitive health. He claimed she is medically unfit to govern the company she built from the ground up. I am standing here tonight accompanied by the Federal Bureau of Investigation to inform you that every single word that just left his mouth was a calculated, malicious lie. A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. I did not give them time to process the shock before pressing the button on the digital clicker. The massive high-definition screen behind me flashed, transitioning from the Cayman Islands banking document to a highly detailed split-screen display. On the left side of the projection, I displayed the fraudulent medical affidavits Bradley had submitted to the local court. On the right side, I projected the unredacted bank transfer logs, showing massive quarterly payments originating directly from Bradley U.S. personal holding accounts. Bradley Vance did not just lie to you about his wife's health. I continued, my voice cutting through the rising murmurs of the crowd like a tactical blade. He actively orchestrated a targeted psychological operation to legally steal her autonomy. He systematically isolated her from her loyal staff, intercepted her communications, and paid off corrupt medical professionals to fabricate a dementia diagnosis. The documents you are currently viewing on the right side of the screen highlight over $200,000 in recurring bribes paid to Dr. Robert Evans and Dr. William Cho. These men violated their medical oaths to help Bradley construct a legal cage around my mother. Both of those doctors are currently being taken into federal custody as we speak. The board members sitting in the front row, the same men Bradley had bribed to fast-track his appointment, began to physically distance themselves from the stage. They looked at the screen, realizing that their association with Bradley had just become a catastrophic legal liability. But elder abuse and extortion were merely the domestic symptoms of a much larger terminal disease. I announced, clicking to the next slide in the digital dossier. Bradley Vance did not just want to steal his wife's fortune. He wanted to use her pristine corporate infrastructure to operate a massive international criminal syndicate. The screen shifted again. This time it displayed the intricate, staggering web of shell corporations, offshore accounts, and ghost vendors that Jax had mapped out in my living room. I used the laser pointer function on the clicker, tracing the bright red line from the legitimate logistics company directly down to the fraudulent entities known as Vanguard Operations and Apex Global Solutions. For the past 3 years, Bradley has been weaponizing this legitimate domestic supply chain to launder tens of millions of dollars in dirty foreign capital, I explained, projecting the cold, hard facts to the audience. He artificially inflated operational expenses, funneling clean corporate liquidity out through fake invoices for international freight forwarding and ghost software maintenance. He then mixed those funds with illicit overseas money and washed the entire sum back through the corporate ledgers as clean profit before routing it to tax havens in the Cayman Islands. I turned slightly, gesturing toward the two frozen figures standing helplessly behind their father. Trent and Ashlyn looked like deer caught in the headlights of a speeding freight train. Ashlyn was weeping silently, her mascara running down her face, ruining her flawless designer aesthetic. Trent was shaking so violently his knees were physically knocking together. Bradley could not operate this massive fraud network alone, I stated, turning my attention back to the silent crowd. He needed loyal proxies to manage the fraudulent shell companies and execute the illegal wire transfers. He utilized his own children. Trent Vance is the primary registered shareholder of Apex Global Solutions. Ashlyn Vance is the registered owner of Vanguard Operations. They have been actively stealing from this company to fund their luxury lifestyles while simultaneously acting as the primary laundering nodes for an international criminal cartel. I clicked the presentation remote one final time. The screen went dark for a fraction of a second before bringing up the audio waveform graphic once again. The brutal, arrogant voices of Trent and Ashlyn flooded the ballroom for a second time. The audience listened in absolute horror as Ashlyn bragged about emptying the corporate reserves and leaving my mother with absolutely nothing. They listened as Trent boasted about being smarter and richer than everyone else, proudly confirming the existence of the offshore banking network. I let the recording play out in its entirety, forcing Bradley, Trent, and Ashlyn to stand there and listen to the exact arrogant words that had sealed their absolute destruction. When the audio clip finally ended, the silence in the ballroom was heavier and more oppressive than before. The investors and corporate elites were looking at the Vance family with pure, unadulterated disgust. They had been lied to, manipulated, and nearly implicated in a massive federal racketeering scheme. I turned off the laser pointer and placed the clicker down on the wooden podium. I looked directly at Bradley. He was a hollowed-out shell of a man. His expensive tuxedo looked entirely too big for his suddenly diminished frame. He was gasping for air, his chest heaving, his eyes darting frantically around the room, looking for a single sympathetic face. He found absolutely none. "My work here is done," I stated, my voice perfectly calm, signaling the end of the intelligence briefing. I took a deliberate step backward, clearing the operational stage. "Special Agent Reynolds, the floor is entirely yours." Special Agent Reynolds stepped forward, his posture radiating absolute federal authority. He bypassed the podium and walked directly up to the trembling, sweating figure of Bradley Vance. Reynolds unclipped the heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt, the metallic clinking sound echoing sharply across the silent stage. Bradley Vance Reynolds announced, his deep voice projecting effortlessly across the ballroom without the need for a microphone. "You are under arrest by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You are being charged with multiple federal counts of wire fraud conspiracy to commit money laundering, extortion, and the aggravated abuse of a vulnerable adult." Bradley let out a pathetic whimpering sound as Reynolds grabbed his right arm and wrenched it forcefully behind his back. The arrogant corporate king offered absolutely zero resistance. He simply collapsed, folding in on himself as the heavy steel cuffs ratcheted tightly around his wrists. The physical reality of the metal binding him shattered his final mental defense. Bradley dropped heavily to his knees right there on the stage, weeping openly in front of the hundreds of elite peers he had desperately wanted to impress. His public humiliation was absolute, complete, and permanently irreversible. Simultaneously, Special Agent Vance and the remaining tactical auditors moved aggressively toward the back of the stage where Trent and Ashlyn were attempting to shrink into the heavy velvet curtains. The moment the agents closed the distance, Ashlyn broke down into hysterical, screaming sobs. She dropped her expensive designer clutch, letting it spill across the stage floor as she raised her hands, begging the agents not to hurt her. "Please!" Ashlyn shrieked, her voice echoing with sheer terror. "It was all his idea. My father made us do it. We did not know where the money was coming from. He forced us to sign those papers. Please do not arrest me. I cannot go to jail." Trent immediately joined the chorus of panicked betrayal, desperately trying to save his own skin by throwing his father directly under the bus. "He lied to us," Trent yelled, as an agent forcefully spun him around and slammed him against the wall to apply the handcuffs. "He told us it was a legitimate tax strategy. We are innocent. He manipulated us just like he manipulated Susan." I stood near the edge of the stage, watching the miserable spectacle unfold. The supposed loyalty of the Vance family had evaporated the precise second they faced actual severe consequences. They were viciously turning on each other, screaming accusations and sobbing for mercy in front of a completely merciless audience. Bradley, kneeling on the floor in his tailored tuxedo, looked up at his children as they actively betrayed him to the federal agents. The sheer profound agony of that realization painted a picture of poetic justice so perfect it almost looked scripted. The federal agents hauled Bradley, Trent, and Ashlyn forcefully to their feet. They did not afford them the dignity of walking out the back service exit. Special Agent Reynolds gripped Bradley firmly by the bicep and marched him directly down the center staircase, leading the disgraced family straight through the middle of the crowded ballroom. The investors and board members stepped back, watching in silent revulsion as the architect of their near ruin was paraded out in steel chains. I stood on the empty stage and watched the heavy oak doors swing shut behind the federal strike team. The threat was entirely neutralized. The hostile takeover had been violently aborted. The corporate parasites who had fed on my mother's hard work and kind heart were currently being loaded into the back of armored federal transport vehicles. I let out a long, slow breath, feeling the residual combat adrenaline finally begin to dissipate from my system. The operation was an absolute, unmitigated tactical success. I stepped off the stage, leaving the federal agents to complete the physical extraction of the targets. The ballroom was completely chaotic now, investors swarming toward the exits, while board members desperately tried to corner the forensic auditors, attempting to distance themselves from the radioactive crater Bradley Vance had just left in the center of their corporate ecosystem. I ignored them all. My objective was complete. I walked back down the center aisle, my combat boots moving in a steady, measured rhythm against the plush carpet. The sea of elite guests parted for me a second time, but the atmosphere had entirely changed. When I walked in, they had looked at me with confusion and aristocratic disdain. As I walked out, they looked at me with absolute profound fear. They had just witnessed a masterclass in asymmetrical warfare, and they wanted absolutely no part of it. I pushed through the heavy oak doors and stepped out into the quiet corridor. Jax was already packing up the mobile command center in the security room, snapping hard drives into reinforced cases. He looked up as I entered, a rare, genuine smile crossing his face. Target neutralized, Jax confirmed, tossing me the primary encrypted drive containing the master files. Target annihilated, I corrected, catching the drive and slipping it into my uniform pocket. The FBI has them in custody. The DOJ will freeze every single asset by morning. I left Jax to finalize the digital scrub and walked out of the Sinclair Hotel. The cool night air hit my face, carrying the scent of rain and city exhaust. For the first time in 6 years, the stifling, oppressive weight of Bradley's toxic presence was completely gone. The quiet daughter was dead. The operator remained. The fallout over the next 72 hours was absolute and brutal. Bradley Vance, alongside Trent and Ashlyn, faced a federal magistrate who took one look at the mountain of irrefutable digital evidence and flatly denied bail for all 3 defendants. The judge cited the massive offshore flight risk and the undeniable flight risk posed by Trent and Ashlyn's previous public boasts. They were remanded directly to a federal detention center, trading their custom tailoring and designer gowns for coarse, high-visibility orange jumpsuits. The Department of Justice moved with terrifying efficiency. They executed emergency asset forfeiture warrants, seizing the sprawling suburban estate, the fleet of luxury vehicles, and the remaining domestic bank accounts. They froze the Cayman Island accounts before Trent could even attempt a transfer from a prison phone. The stolen $42 million was placed under federal lock and key, slated to be fully restituted to my mother's logistics company. Bradley's empire, built entirely on the systematic abuse of a vulnerable woman, evaporated in less than a weekend. The corrupt medical professionals, Dr. Evans and Dr. Cho, were arrested on Monday morning. The federal agents raided their private clinics, seizing their medical records and communication logs. The state medical board instantly suspended their licenses, pending a full criminal investigation into the fabricated dementia diagnoses. The complicit board members, the men Bradley had bribed to fast-track his hostile takeover, were served with federal subpoenas and immediately forced to resign in disgrace, their professional reputations permanently destroyed. My mother's recovery was the most profound victory of the entire operation. Without the heavy, unnecessary medications Bradley had forced upon her, and completely free from his relentless psychological torture, Susan's cognitive sharpness returned with astonishing speed. She was not losing her mind. She had simply been living in a war zone disguised as a marriage. Within 2 weeks, she officially resumed her position as the undisputed CEO of the logistics company. She fired the remaining executives Bradley had installed and reinstated Arthur Hayes as her primary legal counsel. She walked back into her corporate headquarters not as a fragile victim, but as a battle-tested survivor who had literally weathered a hostile federal takeover. 6 months later, the legal battles were merely formalities. Bradley, facing overwhelming evidence and the absolute certainty of a trial loss, accepted a plea deal. He was sentenced to 25 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. Trent and Ashlyn, who had desperately tried to turn state's evidence against their father, received 15 years each for their active roles in the international wire fraud and money laundering conspiracy. Their arrogant, privileged lives were completely over. It was late autumn when my mother and I finally returned to the estate. The government had officially released the property back to Susan after clearing it of Bradley's remaining possessions. We sat together on the expansive back porch, wrapped in thick wool blankets, watching the sunset paint the sky in deep shades of orange and purple. The sprawling, silent mansion no longer felt like a hostile fortress. It felt like a reclaimed territory. I was not wearing my uniform today. I wore comfortable jeans and a simple thick sweater. I did not need the rank insignia or the combat boots to project strength anymore. The need for the disguise was completely gone. My mother handed me a mug of hot coffee, her hands perfectly steady, her eyes bright and clear. "I never really knew what you did in the military," Susan said quietly, looking out over the manicured lawn. "I knew you were an officer, but I always pictured you organizing supply lines or managing personnel files, just like Bradley said." I took a slow sip of the coffee, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. "That was the point, Mom. In my line of work, if people know exactly what you are capable of, you lose the tactical advantage. The most dangerous weapon is the one the enemy never sees coming." She smiled, a genuine, relaxed expression that I had not seen on her face in years. "You certainly proved that. When you walked into that study, when you took him down, I have never seen anyone move like that. You were terrifying." I looked at her, ensuring she understood the core truth of the entire operation. "I was not terrifying, Mom. I was just prepared." Bradley spent his whole life bullying people who played by his polite corporate rules. He thought power was about being the loudest person in the room, wearing the most expensive suit, and intimidating people with lawyers. He fundamentally misunderstood what real power actually is. "And what is real power, Megan?" she asked, her voice soft, carrying a deep, newfound respect. I set the mug down on the small table between us. Real power does not need to brag. It does not need to boast at dinner parties or belittle people to feel important. Real power is absolutely silent. It sits quietly in the background, observing, calculating, and preparing. It only reveals itself when the line is crossed. And when it finally strikes, it does not argue. It simply destroys the threat. Susan nodded slowly, absorbing the truth of the statement. She looked back at the house, taking a deep, cleansing breath of the crisp autumn air. "We are safe now," she stated, not as a question, but as an absolute fact. "We are," I confirmed. The quiet daughter had officially retired. The operator remained vigilant and ready, but entirely at peace. Bradley Vance had demanded to know what the little girl was going to do about his extortion. He had received his answer delivered with devastating, federally mandated precision. I leaned back in the chair, watching the last sliver of the sun dip below the horizon. The war was over. We had secured the high ground, and we were never giving it back. Looking back on the night, I finally stopped hiding my true self. The greatest lesson I learned is that real power never needs to announce its presence. For years, I allowed my stepfather to mistake my silence for weakness. I played the role of the quiet, unremarkable daughter because I thought keeping the peace was the best way to protect my mother. But peace built on submission is just another form of captivity. Toxic people like him thrive on the illusion of power. They use money, status, and cruel words to build a fortress around themselves, convinced that their loud arrogance makes them untouchable. But arrogance is always a vulnerability. It blinds them to the strength of the people they underestimate. You do not have to yell to be heard, and you do not have to fight every petty battle to win the war. Sometimes the most devastating response to abuse is quiet, meticulous preparation. I learned that you cannot heal a toxic family dynamic by shrinking yourself to fit their narrative. You have to be willing to tear down the entire structure to protect what truly matters. My mother and I had to lose the illusion of a perfect family to gain our actual freedom. True family is not about demanding obedience or extracting wealth. It is about mutual respect and absolute safety. If someone in your life is using their position to diminish your worth or control your reality, remember that you always have the right to establish a boundary, and you have the power to defend it. Have you ever had to stop playing small to protect yourself or someone you love from a toxic situation? Share your story in the comments below. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories about reclaiming your power.